Caleb Mercer dragged his daughter by the hair across the kitchen floor while she screamed and clawed at his wrist, her fingernails breaking against his skin, and he didn't even flinch. He threw her into the bedroom like she weighed nothing, like she was a sack of feed. He was done carrying, and when she hit the floor, she tasted blood from where her lip had caught the doorframe. She looked up at him from the floorboards and saw something she had never seen in her father's eyes before. Not anger, not the usual cold disappointment, but calculation. The look of a man deciding whether a problem could be managed or needed to be buried. "You didn't see nothing," he said. Then he pulled the door shut, and she heard the lock turn, and then she heard the hammer. Actual hammer strikes, methodical and unhurried, as he nailed the boards across her window one by one, sealing out every last strip of Wyoming sky. If this kind of story moves you, a daughter trapped by her own blood, and the stranger who broke down the door to free her, please subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning Evelyn Mercer turned 18, her father gave her a silver comb that had belonged to her mother. He set it on the breakfast table without ceremony, without even looking at her, and said only that she ought to keep her hair neat if she wanted anyone to take her seriously. Evelyn had picked up the comb and turned it over in her fingers, feeling the engraved roses along the handle, and she had thanked him the way she always thanked him, quietly, carefully, making sure her voice carried no edge he could catch on. That was how she had learned to live, carefully. Caleb Mercer was not a man who invited softness. He had built the Double M Ranch from river clay and sheer stubbornness over 23 years, and he wore that fact like armor. The ranch hands respected him because they feared him, and the neighboring ranchers gave him space because crossing Caleb Mercer had a way of becoming expensive. He didn't raise his voice often. He didn't need to. There was a quality to his silences that communicated everything a shout would have, and Evelyn had spent her entire life learning to read those silences the way other girls learned to read primer books. Her mother, Rose, had known how to soften him once. Evelyn had vague memories of laughter in the kitchen, of her father's hand resting on her mother's shoulder with something close to tenderness. But Rose Mercer had died of fever when Evelyn was 11, and whatever warmth had lived in Caleb went into the ground with her. What remained was the ranch, the work, and a daughter he seemed to regard as an obligation he hadn't asked for. Evelyn cooked. She mended. She kept the household accounts with more precision than most men in the territory could manage, because Caleb had decided that a useful daughter was better than a useless one, and so he had taught her the numbers himself. She was not unhappy, or she told herself she wasn't. She was practical. She understood that the frontier was not a place that rewarded sentiment, and she had made her peace with a life built around usefulness rather than joy. She just hadn't understood, until that September morning, how thin that peace actually was. She had gone looking for the ink bottle. That was all. The household ledger needed updating, and she had run out, and she knew her father kept a spare in the study that adjoined the main sitting room. The door had been pulled most of the way closed, but not latched, and she had pushed it open with her shoulder because her hands were full of the ledger, and she had taken 2 steps inside before she understood what she was seeing. Her father was standing behind his desk. That part was ordinary. What was not ordinary was the man on the other side of the desk. A heavy-set man in a traveling coat whom Evelyn recognized vaguely as Jonas Pruitt, a cattle trader who came through the territory twice a year buying up stock for eastern markets. What was not ordinary was the way Jonas Pruitt was leaning over the desk with both hands planted on it, his face pulled tight with something between anger and fear, saying, "You promised me those papers would be clean, Caleb. You promised me." And then her father picked up the letter opener from the corner of the desk. Evelyn would think about it later, would replay the next 30 seconds until they felt worn smooth from overuse, and she would never be able to explain why she didn't move. She should have backed out. She should have made some noise, dropped the ledger, announced herself. But her body had simply stopped, seized by something colder than fear, and she stood there in the doorway while her father drove the letter opener into Jonas Pruitt's neck with the same unhurried deliberateness that he used for everything, for branding calves, for signing contracts, for telling Evelyn her dinner wasn't salted right. Pruitt made a sound she would never be able to describe. Then he went down behind the desk, and the room was very quiet, and her father straightened his vest and looked up. His eyes found her in the doorway. Neither of them spoke for what felt like a full minute. "Evelyn," her father said finally. His voice was exactly the same as always, level, patient. "Put the ledger down and come sit." She ran. She didn't make it far. The house wasn't large and her father had longer legs, and she had barely reached the kitchen door when his hand closed around her arm with a grip that had 40 years of ranch work behind it. She twisted, scratched, made every sound she could think to make, and none of it mattered at all. He dragged her back through the hall, across the kitchen floor, and threw her into her bedroom with the flat efficiency of a man who had already decided what came next. The door locked. Then the hammer started. She heard him tell Hicks, the ranch hand who slept in the bunkhouse nearest the main building, that she had taken ill and needed quiet. She heard Hicks say yes, sir, without a moment's hesitation, because Hicks had been on the Double M for 11 years and had learned the same lesson everyone learned. Caleb Mercer's business was Caleb Mercer's business. The first day, Evelyn spent most of it at the door. She called out when she heard footsteps, pounded on the wood until her hands ached, pressed her face to the gap at the bottom, and shouted for anyone who might be passing close enough to hear. Nobody came. The gap under the door was barely an inch, enough for thin slivers of light, enough to hear the ordinary sounds of the ranch continuing without her, but not enough for anything that mattered. Her father slid a tin plate under the door that evening. Cornbread and a little salt pork, gone cold by the time it reached her. She ate it because she was already hungry enough that pride felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. The second day she searched the room. She had done this before, years ago, as a child playing at adventure, and she knew every inch of that space, but she searched it again anyway with the methodical desperation of someone who understood their situation had changed completely. The window was solid, 3 boards across the outside, and the glass was old and thick, and even if she broke it, the boards held, and there was nothing in the room she could use to pry them. The floor was hardwood over a crawl space, but the boards were nailed firm, and she had nothing to lift them with. The walls were plank and plaster, solid, built to last Wyoming winters. She was 18 years old, and she was going to die in the room where she had slept every night of her life. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the silver comb on the washstand, and she thought about her mother, and then she stopped thinking about her mother because it made her chest seize in a way she couldn't afford. She thought instead about Jonas Pruitt, about what she knew of him. Not much, but some. She knew he came through twice yearly with his buying ledger and his traveling coat. She knew he and her father had done business for as long as she could remember. And she knew, from the household accounts she kept with such care, that there were payments in the Double M records that had never made sense to her. Sums arriving from sources labeled only with initials, transactions recorded in her father's handwriting that corresponded to nothing visible on the ranch. She had noted them and filed them and never asked, because she had been raised not to ask. Now she understood, or the shape of it, at least. Whatever her father and Jonas Pruitt had been doing together, it had gone wrong. And Pruitt had come to collect, or to threaten, or to demand something Caleb had decided he couldn't give. And Caleb Mercer, faced with a problem he couldn't manage, had buried it. The third day her father came to the door. "This doesn't have to be permanent," he said from the other side. His voice was almost gentle, the way it got sometimes when he was trying to be reasonable. "You understand why I can't let you go. You understand what you saw." Evelyn sat against the far wall with her knees pulled up and said nothing. "I am your father," he said. "I have taken care of you your whole life. I need you to understand what's at stake here, for both of us." She said, "You killed a man." Pause. Then, "Jonas Pruitt was not a good man. He was threatening our family. He was threatening you." "Same thing." "It isn't," she said. "It never was." She heard him breathe through the door. She heard him shift his weight. He had a bad left knee from an old horse fall, and when he was agitated, he moved differently, put weight on the right without thinking. She had known these things about him her whole life. She had built her whole life around knowing them. "I won't ask you to lie," he said. "I'll just ask you to stay quiet, that's all. Stay quiet, and this is over, and we go back to the way things were." "The way things were," she repeated. "Yes." She didn't answer after that, and eventually she heard him walk away. The fourth day, she started to feel the particular despair of someone who has run out of plans. Not the sharp panic of the first hours, but something duller and heavier. The settling weight of a situation that showed no exit. She ate what came under the door. She slept in her clothes because the room had grown cold, and she was afraid to waste the warmth of the blanket on anything other than sleep. She tried to think and found her thoughts circling without landing anywhere useful. And then, mid-morning of the fourth day, she heard a wagon. She heard it from some distance. The particular rumble of a heavily loaded rig, more than one horse, the creak of axles that needed grease. She pressed herself against the boarded window and listened, trying to separate the sounds. Men's voices. Her father's voice among them, carrying the specific tone he used for business. Measured, professional, the voice of a man presenting himself as someone you could trust. She had perhaps 20 minutes, maybe 30. Whatever her father was doing out there, he would be occupied, and the ranch hands would be focused on the visitors. And for the first time in 4 days, she had a window. Not literally, not in any way that helped her, but a window in time, a narrow gap in which something might be possible if she was willing to make enough noise. She looked around the room for the 10th time, and her eyes stopped on the lamp. The oil lamp on the washstand, half full, with a spare tin of oil on the shelf above it, because she had always been careful about keeping supplies stocked, had always maintained the household with the diligence her father had praised, and that now might be the thing that kept her alive. She lit the lamp with the matches she kept in the drawer. Always kept matches in the drawer. Practical, useful Evelyn. And she stared at the flame for a moment, thinking about what she was about to do. She pulled the mattress halfway off the bed and piled it against the door. She took every piece of cloth in the room, her spare dress, her underthings, 2 wool blankets, and laid them on top of the mattress. Then she tilted the oil tin and soaked the pile as thoroughly as she dared. She needed smoke, not fire. She didn't want to burn. She wanted to smoke, wanted to fill this room with something that forced a response. But she understood that the line between the two was thin, and she was going to have to walk it without flinching. She touched the lamp flame to the edge of the pile. It caught slowly at first, then faster. The wet wool produced exactly what she needed, thick gray smoke that rolled up the wall and spread across the ceiling and, within 3 minutes, was pouring visibly from the gap under the door and the barely there cracks around the boarded window. She pressed herself against the floor where the air was still breathable, and she screamed. Not in panic, in deliberate, sustained, full-voiced screaming, the kind that carried across a ranch yard. She heard shouting outside, heard boots on the porch stairs, heard her father's voice, sharp now, telling someone it was nothing, a cooking accident, leave it alone. Heard another voice, a voice she didn't recognize, lower and steadier, saying, "Sir, there's smoke coming out of that window and somebody's hollering." "It's my daughter," her father said. She's not well. She does this." "She does what?" the unfamiliar voice said. "She sets fires?" Evelyn screamed again and pounded on the door with both fists, alternating between the flat of her hands and the heel of her boot, creating as much noise as the room would allow. The smoke was getting thicker. Her eyes were watering so badly she could barely see. She pressed her face into the crook of her elbow and kept making noise. "Sir?" The stranger's voice again, closer now, right on the other side of the door. "Sir, I need you to open this door." "This is my house," her father said. "My land. You have no authority." "I'm not claiming authority. I'm telling you that if you don't open that door, I'm going to open it myself." A pause. Her father said something she couldn't hear clearly. Then the stranger said, in a voice that was no longer asking for anything at all, "Move." And the door came in. Not the lock, the whole door, the wood splintering around the frame where someone had hit it with their shoulder and kept pushing, and the makeshift barricade of mattress and smoldering cloth shifted back across the floor, and suddenly there was light and air and a shape coming through the smoke toward her. She scrambled backward on instinct before she realized he wasn't her father. He was taller than her father, leaner, with a gray hat pushed back on his head and eyes that were already scanning the room, calculating, assessing, the way a man looks when he's trying to understand a situation fast. He crossed to her in 2 strides, crouched down to her level on the floor, and said, "You hurt?" She said, "No." He said, "Can you walk?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Then we need to move right now. Can you do that?" And something about the directness of it, no preamble, no explanation, no version of "I'll handle this" or "Don't worry," made something loosen in her chest that had been locked tight for 4 days. She grabbed his arm and got to her feet, and they went through the door together. Her father was standing in the hallway. 3 other men were behind him. She recognized two of them as hands from her father's payroll, but the third was a stranger, young and broad-shouldered, with his hand resting on the side of his belt in a way that was not quite threatening, but was not casual either. Her father looked at her, and then at the man who had her arm, and his face went through several expressions very quickly. "Wyatt," he said, and his voice had changed again. The business voice was back, smooth and controlled. "I appreciate your concern, but this is a family matter." The man, Wyatt, said, "Family matter." He said it like he was testing the words to see if they'd hold weight. They didn't seem to, from his expression. "My daughter has been unwell. She's been confused. She gets frightened and sometimes she boarded herself in her own room," Wyatt said. Her father hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "She's done it before." "From the outside?" Another pause. Her father's expression shifted again. She recognized it now, recognized it the way you recognize a sound you've heard in nightmares. He was deciding. Running the numbers in his head the same way he ran all numbers, calculating what could be managed and what needed to be buried. "Evelyn," her father said, looking at her directly. Tell him you've been unwell." She looked at him. She looked at this man who had given her a silver comb that morning and killed a man that afternoon. She thought about all the years of careful quiet, all the careful, practiced invisibility, all the plates slid under doors and silences maintained and prices paid for someone else's peace of mind. She said, "My name is Evelyn Mercer. My father has held me in that room for 4 days. I haven't done anything wrong, and I need to leave this house." Her father moved first. He was fast for a man his age. She had never underestimated that about him. And he covered the distance between himself and Wyatt in one stride with his hand going for Wyatt's collar. What happened next happened faster than she could fully track. There was a short, sharp exchange of motion, and then her father was against the wall with his arm bent up behind him and his face turned sideways against the plank, and Wyatt was behind him saying, very quietly, "That was a bad idea." Her father said something low and furious that she didn't quite catch. Wyatt said, "I'm going to let you go, and then you're going to stay right there while your daughter gets whatever she needs from this house. And then we're leaving. Are we clear?" "You don't know what you're getting into," her father said. "You don't know anything about this situation." "I know enough," Wyatt said. He released her father's arm and stepped back, keeping himself between Caleb and Evelyn without making a production of it. Just positioned himself there, a physical fact in the hallway, while Evelyn moved past both of them toward her bedroom. She went in quickly, didn't think too hard about what to take, grabbed the silver comb because it had been her mother's, grabbed her heaviest coat and her good boots, and the small tin box from under the floorboard where she kept what little money she had managed to save over 3 years of careful household management. $42 and some change. She had been saving without knowing what she was saving for. She came back into the hallway with everything under her arm and found her father still against the wall, not being held there anymore, just standing there, watching her with that calculating look. "You have nowhere to go," he said. "You think this stranger is going to protect you? You think he has any idea what he's walking into?" She stopped. She looked at him. She thought for just a moment about the man he had been when she was small enough that he would carry her on his shoulders to look over the fence line. She thought about that man, and then she let him go, the way you let a dream go when you wake up and realize it was never real. "Goodbye, Papa," she said. The young broad-shouldered man who'd come with Wyatt had 2 horses ready in the yard. She didn't ask how. She just climbed up on the one that was clearly meant for her and didn't look back at the porch where she knew her father was standing. She heard Wyatt mount beside her. She heard him say something brief to his man about the wagon and the cattle business that had brought them here. Something about regrouping 2 miles east, and then they were moving out through the double M gate and onto the open road. And the September wind hit her face and she breathed it in like she had forgotten air could smell like this. She didn't cry. She had expected she might, expected some collapse of the composure she had maintained through 4 days of locked doors and cold cornbread and her father's voice through the wall. But there was nothing like that, just a strange crystalline clarity, the particular alertness of someone who understands that everything has changed and that whatever comes next, it begins right now. Wyatt rode beside her without speaking for a while. She appreciated that. He seemed to understand that she didn't need talking at yet. After perhaps a mile, he said, "You got anywhere to go?" She said, "No." He said, "All right, you can ride with us far as you need to." She looked at him sideways. He was watching the road ahead, his hat brim pulled against the wind, with the particular self-containment of a man who was comfortable saying exactly what he meant, and not a word more. She said, "You don't know me." He said, "No." "Then why—" "Because whatever was happening in that room," he said, "wasn't something I was willing to ride past." She thought about that. Then she said, "My father won't let this go." He said, "I figured." She said, "You might not understand what that means. He has men. He has resources, and he has reach across most of this territory, and he is not a man who forgives being crossed." Wyatt turned his head and looked at her for the first time since they'd ridden out, and she saw that his eyes were the same kind of steady that his voice was. Not unafraid, she thought, but acquainted with fear, comfortable with its presence. He said, "I've been running cattle through hard country for 12 years, Miss Mercer. I've dealt with difficult men before." She said, "Not like him." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said simply, "Maybe not. We'll see." They rode on. The wind came down off the mountains to the west, and the grass bent flat along the hillsides, and the sky above it all was that particular Wyoming blue that made everything else look small. Evelyn held her coat closed with one hand and the silver comb in the other, and told herself that this, all of it, the fear and the uncertainty, and the strange man riding beside her who had broken down a door for a woman he'd never met, this was not the end of anything. She told herself it was the beginning. She held on to that with both hands, because she had just walked away from the only life she had ever known, and the man behind her was not finished, and she understood with cold clarity that the locked door her father had built around her was one thing, but the war he would launch to drag her back was another thing entirely, and it was already starting. 2 miles east, Wyatt's cattle outfit was camped along a creek bend. 8 men, 300 head, and a trail cook named Burl, who looked at Evelyn when they rode in and said, "You look like you ain't eaten in a week." She said, 4 days. He said, "Same difference," and handed her a tin of beans that were still warm from the fire, and she ate them standing up because sitting felt like giving something in, and she wasn't ready to give anything yet. Wyatt dismounted and spoke with his men briefly, not explaining everything, just enough, just the shape of it. And she watched his crew absorb the information with the pragmatic equanimity of people who had learned that the trail was never simple and you dealt with what came. A man named Cole, who appeared to be Wyatt's segundo, asked one question. "He gonna come after us?" Wyatt said yes. Cole nodded and said he'd set a night watch. That was the whole conversation. She finished the beans and set down the tin and looked out at the cattle settling for the evening along the creek, and she thought, these people just accepted trouble on her behalf without being asked, without ceremony, without negotiation. Cole had not debated the ethics of it. Burl had not questioned whether she deserved beans. They had simply folded her into the existing order of things and adjusted around her presence. She had never experienced anything like that in her life. Wyatt came and stood near her. Not close, just near, leaning against the wagon wheel with his hat in his hands. He said, "You should sleep. We're moving at first light." She said, "I won't sleep." He said, "Maybe not, but you should try." She looked at him. She said, "Why did you come to my father's ranch today?" He said, "Cattle business. He was supposed to sell me 30 head. We'd been negotiating by letter for 2 months. She said, "And instead you ended up with a fugitive." He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, more the suggestion of one, the crease at the corner of his mouth that implied the capacity for humor, even if the moment wasn't quite right for it. He said, 30 head would have been easier. She said, "I'm sorry." He looked at her steadily and said, "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Apologize for surviving." She held his gaze. Then she looked back out at the cattle and the creek and the first stars coming out above the ridge, and she said, "There are things about my father you need to know. Things I should have told you when we rode out, but I needed—" She stopped. "You needed a minute," he said. "Yes." He settled his hat back on his head and crossed his arms. "All right, tell me." So she told him. She told him about the payments in the ledger that never matched anything real on the ranch. She told him about the men who sometimes came after dark and met with her father in the study, men she had never been introduced to and whose voices she had sometimes heard through the wall, arguing over numbers and territories, and something she had always understood to be dangerous without quite knowing why. She told him about the cattle that sometimes arrived at the Double M without paperwork and left 2 days later in different configuration, bound for different buyers, as if they had become different animals simply by changing hands. She told him about disappearances, 2 ranch hands over the years who had quit without collecting their final pay and been replaced without comment, and 1 man from a neighboring spread who had ridden over to discuss water rights and never ridden home. She told him, and she watched his face while she did, and she saw that he had already suspected something, that the visit to her father's ranch had not been entirely straightforward on his end either, that the cattle negotiation had perhaps served purposes she didn't yet fully understand, but that what she was telling him went beyond whatever he had expected. When she finished, the fire had burned down and the cattle had settled and most of the crew had turned in. Cole was on watch somewhere in the darkness. Burl had left a fresh tin of coffee within reach and then very tactfully disappeared. Wyatt was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your father isn't just a man who killed someone. He's running an operation." "Yes," she said, "and you're the only person who's seen his books and can speak to what's in them." "Yes, which means," he said, "that you're not just his daughter anymore. You're his biggest problem." She said, "I know." He said, "And you're telling me this because you want me to understand what's coming." She said, "I'm telling you because you deserve to know what you've walked into. You can still put me down at the next town and ride on, and I won't blame you for it." He looked at her. The firelight was behind him now, and she couldn't read his expression clearly, but his voice when he spoke was the same as it had been all evening, level, direct, without drama. He said, "I broke down that door, Miss Mercer. I didn't do that so I could set you down at the next town and ride on." She didn't answer. She was afraid that if she said anything, the crystalline clarity she had been holding on to all day would crack, and she needed it a little longer, just a little longer. "Get some sleep," he said again. "Tomorrow's going to be a long ride." She lay down in the spare bedroll Burl had laid out for her near the wagon, and she stared up at the Wyoming stars. So many of them, indifferent and brilliant and completely unconcerned with the lives of the people below them. And she thought about her father in the study with Jonas Pruitt. She thought about the letter opener. She thought about the hammer and the boards, and 4 days of cold cornbread, and the particular silence of a man deciding whether a problem could be managed or buried. She thought about the door coming in. She would not be buried. She closed her eyes, and somewhere in the distance a nighthawk called once, and the creek murmured over its stones, and the cattle breathed their slow, collective breath, and Evelyn Mercer, 18 years old, $42, and some change in a tin box, everything she had ever known behind her and nothing certain ahead, slept. She dreamed of her mother, not the dying. She almost never dreamed of the dying, but an earlier time, her mother standing at the kitchen window with the morning light coming through it, turning to look at Evelyn with an expression Evelyn had spent 7 years trying to remember exactly. And in the dream, she finally got it right. It was not sadness. It was not pride. It was something simpler than either. It was the look of a woman who believed her daughter would be all right. She woke before first light to Cole's quiet footsteps and the sound of cattle beginning to stir. The stars were still out. The fire had gone to ash. Across the camp, she could see Wyatt already up and moving, pulling on his coat in the pre-dawn gray, already thinking about whatever needed to be thought about next. She sat up. She ran her mother's comb through her hair. She folded the blanket and set it on the wagon rail and put on her boots and stood up. She was ready. Whatever was coming next, and she had no illusions about how bad it might get, how far her father's reach extended, how little mercy he would extend to the daughter who had walked out of his house with a stranger and everything she knew about his crimes. She was ready for it, or she told herself she was. Because the alternative was to stop here, on this creek bank in the pre-dawn dark, and she had not survived 4 days in a locked room in order to stop. The cattle were moving. Wyatt was calling quiet orders. The outfit was packing up and heading out, and Evelyn Mercer walked to the horse that had been saddled for her, took the reins without being told, and swung up into the saddle like she'd been doing it every morning of her life. Because she had. And whatever her father had taken from her, he had not taken that. She rode out with Wyatt's outfit into the Wyoming morning, and behind her the Double M was already small and getting smaller. And somewhere back there her father was waking up and understanding what had happened. And she knew, with the same cold certainty she had felt in the locked room, the same certainty that had led her to light a fire rather than wait quietly for an end, that it was not over. It was only beginning. The first morning on the trail was the hardest, not because of the cold, though the cold was real enough. That particular September bite that came down off the Wyoming ridgelines before the sun had any strength to it, the kind that worked through a coat and found the places where you were still shaken from everything that had happened. Not even because of the cattle, which were loud and contrary and smelled exactly the way several hundred animals in close proximity always smell, which is to say badly. The hardest part was the way the other men looked at her, not with hostility, that she could have handled. Hostility was something she understood and had learned to navigate around, the same way you navigate around furniture in a dark room, by memory and by careful movement. What the men looked at her with was something more complicated than hostility. It was assessment. 8 pairs of eyes that had spent years reading country and weather and livestock and other men now turned on a young woman who had appeared in their camp the night before with smoke in her hair and $42 in a tin box, and they were deciding what to make of her. Cole, Wyatt Segundo, a raw-boned man in his mid-30s with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something that didn't want to be carved, was the most direct about it. He waited until Wyatt had ridden ahead to check the lead cattle and then pulled his horse alongside hers and said, without preamble, "You know how to ride?" She said, "I was riding before I could properly walk." He said, "That's what everybody says." She said, "Then watch me," and put her heels to the horse and moved up along the left flank of the herd at a pace that was not showy but was also not cautious, reading the cattle the way she had been reading them since childhood, feeling where they were comfortable and where they wanted to drift, making the small adjustments that kept 300 head moving in the right direction without anyone having to raise their voice. When she came back, Cole said nothing. But he didn't look at her the same way again either. Burl, the trail cook, had already decided to like her, apparently on the basis that she had eaten his beans without complaint and said thank you. He was a small, round-faced man of 50 or so who managed the supply wagon with the organized ferocity of someone who had learned that food was the only thing standing between a functional cattle outfit and complete collapse. And he seemed to regard her as a welcome addition to the operation, primarily because, as he told her that first morning, most cowboys thought thanking a cook was beneath them, and it was nice to have someone with manners. A man named Decker, young, maybe 22, with a perpetual look of mild worry that Evelyn would later learn was just his natural expression rather than a reaction to anything specific, asked her what part of the territory she was from. When she said the double M, he went quiet in a way that told her the double M had a reputation that traveled further than her father's cattle business. She filed that information away and didn't press him on it. The rest of the crew learned her name and used it and went back to work, which was the most functional thing anyone could have done. Wyatt came back from the lead around mid-morning and rode alongside her for a while without speaking. She had noticed he did this, rode alongside people without immediately filling the silence, as if he understood that most things sorted themselves out better without interference. It was different from her father's silences, which had always been loaded, always waiting for something. Wyatt's silences were more like weather, just present, not pointed. She said, "How far to the next water stop?" He said, "Creek crossing about 4 miles east. After that, we'll make the Hennessy Road by dark if the weather holds." She said, "Are we being followed?" He didn't answer immediately. She watched him scan the ridge to the south in that particular way of his, systematic, unhurried, the way a man looks when he's checking something he's already expecting to find rather than hoping not to. He said, "Not yet. But your father isn't a man who waits long to do anything," he said, "and he's had since before sunup to decide what he wants to do about yesterday." She said, "He'll send Hicks first, and maybe 2 others, to see how the land lies before he commits to anything visible." Wyatt looked at her. "You know how he operates." "I've watched him my whole life," she said. "He doesn't act without information. He'll send scouts before he sends force. The scouts won't engage. They'll just watch and count and report back. Then he'll decide." "How long does that take him?" She thought about it. 2 days, maybe 3. He's methodical. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's useful to know." "It gives us time to think," she said, "but not much." He nodded slowly. She had the sense he was recalibrating something in his head, adjusting a plan she hadn't been shown yet. She didn't push. She was beginning to understand that Wyatt Boone was a man who shared information in the order he deemed necessary, and that pushing him moved nothing. That afternoon the wind changed and the cattle got restless. Decker took a horn from a young bull that should have been better contained and came back to the wagon, holding his forearm, with his face doing complicated things. Burl cleaned it and wrapped it tight and told Decker he should have been paying attention, which was not particularly compassionate but was accurate, and Decker accepted it in the spirit it was offered. Evelyn helped hold the bandaging. She had done this kind of thing on the ranch. You didn't live on a working spread without learning to manage injuries that weren't worth the 2-day ride to a doctor, and her hands were steady enough that Burl, in the middle of wrapping, gave her a sideways look and said, "You do this before?" She said, "More than I'd like." He said, "Can you stitch?" She said, "When it's needed." He said, "Good. I've got 4 cowboys who can't stitch their own socks, and one of them always ends up needing it on the trail." It was not a formal welcome to the outfit, but it was something. That evening, camped on the east bank of the creek crossing, she sat near the fire and felt the full weight of the previous 5 days arrive all at once, the way exhaustion sometimes waits politely until you stop moving before hitting you with everything at once. She put her hands over the fire and stared into it, and tried not to think about Jonas Pruitt's blood on her father's study floor, tried not to think about the hammer and the boards, tried especially not to think about her father's face when she had said goodbye in the hallway, that brief flash of something under the calculation, something almost human that she had glimpsed and then immediately wished she hadn't. Cole came and sat across the fire from her. He was not a man who made social calls as far as she had observed, so she waited. He said, "Wyatt told us some of what you told him last night." She said, "How much?" "Enough." He poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise. "The operation your father's running, the cattle going through without papers." "You're wondering if we've bought any of it," she said. "His cattle, whether this outfit has ever done business with him." Cole looked at her with something approaching respect. "Have you?" She said, "I don't know your outfit's full history, but I can tell you the Double M typically moved its irregular stock south through intermediaries. If you've bought cattle from a man named Pruitt in the last 5 years, it's possible." "Pruitt." His expression changed slightly. "He's the one." "Yes," she said. Cole stared into the fire for a while. Then he said, "What you're describing isn't just one man doing something wrong. It's a network." "Yes." "Stretching how far?" "I don't know exactly," she said. "Far enough that my father felt protected. Far enough that when men from neighboring spreads started asking questions about missing stock, nothing ever came of it. Because he had people in the right places." "I think so. Lawmen, maybe. Possibly a judge or two. I don't know names. I only know what I can see in the ledgers, and the ledgers were designed to be unclear." Cole was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Decker had fallen asleep sitting up against his saddle, which appeared to be a talent of his. Somewhere in the dark, the cattle shifted and resettled. Cole said, "You understand what this means for us. If what you're describing is real, and it sounds real, then the moment your father decides this outfit has information that can hurt him, we're not just in the middle of a family dispute." "I know," she said. "We're in the middle of something bigger." "I know that too," she said. "I told Wyatt last night you deserve to know. I'm telling you the same thing now. You can put me down at the next town. I won't—" "We're not putting you down at the next town," Cole said flatly. He said it the same way he might report on water depth at the crossing. As a fact, not a decision being made in the moment. "I just want us all to be clear on what we're dealing with." She looked at him. "Why?" "You don't know me." He shrugged, which on his angular frame looked like geological movement. "Wyatt broke that door down. I've ridden with Wyatt 8 years. He doesn't do things without reason." He paused. "And reason or not, a man who boards up his own daughter's window and slides food under the door for 4 days has already told me everything I need to know about whose side I'm on." She didn't say anything. She found she couldn't, quite. Cole stood up and knocked the dust off his hat against his knee and said, "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be worse than today." It was. The second day the sky turned the color of old pewter by mid-morning, and the wind picked up from the northwest with real intention behind it. The cattle didn't like it. Cattle never liked weather they couldn't see coming. And keeping 300 head moving in the right direction in a sideways wind required everyone's full attention and left no room for anything else. Evelyn worked the left flank for 6 solid hours, reading the herd and the wind simultaneously, making herself useful in the only language that mattered out here, which was the language of getting the job done without being told twice. Around mid-afternoon, with the weather getting uglier and the cattle getting more creative about their objections, a young steer broke from the left flank and went into the brush at a dead run. Standard enough. It happened. The usual response was to send whoever was closest and bring it back before it got into real trouble. The closest person was Evelyn. She didn't wait to be told. She went after it immediately, into the brush and the broken ground east of the trail where the vegetation thickened along a dry creek bed, pushing her horse through it at a pace that was probably too fast for the terrain, but that was the only pace that would catch a spooked steer before it was completely gone. She could hear it ahead of her, crashing through the brush, panicked, making everything worse in the way that frightened animals always do. She cut east to get ahead of it, reading the lay of the ground without thinking about it, just feeling the way the terrain wanted to push things and placing herself where the steer would naturally come to. She came out of the brush at the edge of a shallow ravine, and there it was, young, wild-eyed, ready to bolt in any direction that wasn't back. She turned her horse sideways and made herself large and set her voice at exactly the register she had learned from watching ranch hands work cattle since before she could reach the top rail of a fence, and the steer slowed and stopped and then, after a long standoff that went 3 or 4 minutes and felt like 30, turned and went back into the brush in approximately the right direction. She was bringing it back toward the herd when she heard the other horse. Not from the trail. From behind her, from the northeast, which was not the direction anyone from Wyatt's outfit would be coming from. She turned her head and for a moment saw nothing, just brush and broken ground and the pewter sky above it. And then she saw him. A rider, sitting still about 200 yards out, doing exactly nothing, just watching. He was wearing a brown coat she didn't recognize, but the horse under him was a double M gray. She knew every horse on her father's spread. She turned back to the steer and kept moving, kept her pace and her posture exactly the same, giving no sign that she'd seen anything. She brought the steer back to the herd and rejoined the left flank and waited until Cole rode close enough to speak quietly. She said, "We have company. Northeast. One rider, double M horse, been sitting still watching for at least 5 minutes." Cole's face didn't change. He said, "How far out?" 200 yards when I saw him. Maybe more now." "Armed?" "Couldn't tell." Cole said, "You said your father sends scouts first." "Yes." "So this is the watching part." "Yes." "All right." Cole rode on without changing his pace, and a few minutes later she saw him pull alongside Wyatt at the point and speak briefly. Wyatt didn't look northeast. He didn't change anything about the way he was riding, but his hand moved slightly, and 2 of his men shifted their positions in the herd in a way that looked like routine adjustment and wasn't. That was the moment she understood something about this outfit that she hadn't fully appreciated yet. These were not just cowboys. They were men who had moved cattle through territory where things went wrong in ways that required responses beyond the purely agricultural, and they had figured out how to be ready for those responses without advertising the fact. She filed that away too. That evening, Wyatt came to her after the camp was set and the cattle were settled and said, "You were right about the scouts. Cole counted 2 more after the one you spotted. They didn't come in, didn't do anything, just watched." She said, "He's counting us, measuring what he's dealing with. How many men does he have that would follow him into something like this?" She thought about it carefully. Hicks, definitely. Hicks has been there 11 years, and he's loyal out of habit more than anything. He's never had to think about whether what he's doing is right because my father never asked him to think. Probably 4 others from the regular crew who've been on the double M long enough to be in it deep, whether they wanted to be or not. She paused. And then there are the others, the ones who aren't regular crew. I've seen 6 or 8 of them over the years, coming and going, the ones who don't get introduced, those I can't predict. Wyatt said, "So somewhere between 6 and 15. "Possibly." He said, "We're 8. She said, "I know the math." He looked at her for a moment. He had a way of looking at her that was different from how he looked at other things. The same attention, the same careful inventory, but with something else underneath it that she hadn't fully identified yet and wasn't sure she wanted to. He said, "You're not frightened." She said, "I'm terrified." He said, "You don't show it." She said, "I spent 18 years not showing it. I'm very practiced." A pause. Terrified doesn't mean helpless. It just means the stakes are real. He considered that. Then he said, "There's a town called Ridgecross, about a day and a half north. Territorial Marshal has an office there, man named Aldridge. I've dealt with him before. He's not easy, but he's straight. You want to go to the law? Eventually, yes, but not empty-handed. What you've described about those ledgers, if we could get testimony from you in front of a federal marshal, someone with actual reach beyond this county." "My father has reach too," she said. "I told you." "I know, but there's a difference between reach and immunity. Nobody's immune if the evidence is solid enough and the person presenting it is credible and alive." He said the last word without particular emphasis, but they both heard it. She said, "What do you need from me?" He said, "Write down everything you know. Everything specific, dates, amounts, names if you have them. The things you remember from the ledgers. Everything you've seen or heard that you can put in specific terms." She looked at him. "You want documentation. I want everything that's in your head on paper before something happens to make it impossible to get it out." She said, "That's a dark way to put it." He said, "It's an accurate way to put it." She thought about it. Then she said, "Give me paper and I'll start tonight." Burl produced a notebook from the supply wagon that he said he used for recipe notes and expense tracking, and he tore out the used pages and gave her the rest without explanation, along with a pencil worn to about half its original length. She sat by the fire and wrote for 2 hours while the camp settled around her, writing everything she could remember in the clearest terms she could manage, dates where she had them, approximate amounts where she didn't, the initials from the ledger entries, the patterns she had noticed over years of keeping accounts that she had been too careful to question. It came to 11 pages in her small, precise handwriting. She gave the notebook to Wyatt when she was done. He looked at the first page and then at her and said, "This is very specific." She said, "I have a good memory for numbers, always have." He said, "Your father know that?" She said, "He's the one who taught me to keep accounts." "So, yes, probably." A pause. "He made me useful without considering that useful people remember things." Wyatt held the notebook for a moment, then tucked it inside his coat. He said, "I'm going to have Cole ride ahead to Ridgecross tomorrow morning. Get word to Marshal Aldridge that we're coming and what we're bringing." She said, "And in the meantime?" He said, "In the meantime, we keep moving." She nodded and moved to go, and then stopped and turned back. She said, "Wyatt." He looked at her. She said, "Why did you come to my father's ranch yourself? You said you were negotiating for cattle. Most men at your level send a hand for that. Why did you go personally?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because I'd heard things. About the Double M, about the kind of operation your father ran. Nothing specific enough to bring to law, but enough that I wanted to see the place for myself." She felt something shift in her chest. She said, "You weren't just buying cattle." "I was also buying cattle," he said, which was not exactly a denial. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Who told you to look?" He said, "A rancher south of here named Clement Briggs. He lost 200 head 18 months ago and never got an answer about where they went. He had a theory." She said, "I know that name. There's an entry in my father's books. I couldn't match it to anything. $312 received, no source listed. Same month, Briggs would have reported the loss." Wyatt's jaw tightened slightly. $312, he repeated. "Approximately what 200 head of mid-grade stock might sell for at a quick transaction," she said, "through intermediaries who take a cut." They looked at each other. She said, "You came there looking for evidence, and you found me instead." He said, "I found both." She turned that over in her mind, then she said, "Did Clement Briggs hire you?" "No," he said. "He asked me to look. I chose to. There's a difference." "Why?" she said. "He's not your rancher. His cattle aren't your loss." Wyatt looked at her with that steady, level quality that she was coming to recognize as his fundamental setting. Not cold, exactly, but contained, like a fire that knew its own edges. He said, "Because people like your father count on everyone minding their own business, and someone has to decide at some point that it's their business." She thought about that for a long time after she lay down. She thought about Clement Briggs and 200 head and $312 in her father's ledger, under no name, just an amount and a date, fitting together with a rancher's loss like a key into a lock she hadn't known existed. She thought about Wyatt riding into the Double M yard with a story about cattle negotiations and a real purpose underneath it, and the way the smoke from her fire had changed both their calculations in the same moment. She thought about how things that seem like accidents often aren't, or aren't entirely, or are accidents that land exactly where something was already prepared to receive them. She slept badly and woke up before the watch changed with a feeling she couldn't name, something between dread and the strange sharpened alertness that comes from understanding that a situation is accelerating faster than you can fully track. Cole left before first light, riding north toward Ridge Cross with the notebook tucked in his saddlebag and a set of instructions from Wyatt that she wasn't privy to. She watched him go and felt the outfit shift slightly around the absence, 8 down to 7, and she was aware that she was not a cowboy and could not fully replace a cowboy's function, which meant the work was being redistributed among men who already had enough of it. She worked twice as hard that day to compensate. Nobody told her to. Nobody noticed in a way they expressed aloud. But by midday, Decker had stopped giving her the worried look and started giving her the look he gave the other hands, which was no look at all, just basic professional acknowledgement, which was exactly what she wanted. Around midday, a different thing happened. There was a moment of stillness in the herd. The particular stillness that preceded something, the way cattle collective awareness sensed things before the humans around them did. And then the whole left quarter of the herd swung east in one motion, not panicked, just strongly motivated. And the reason became clear a moment later when 3 riders came out of the tree line to the west at a canter. Not scouts this time. These men were riding toward the herd with the particular directional purpose of people who had a destination. Evelyn felt her stomach drop and put her hand on the horse's neck instinctively, steadying herself. She counted them. 3. Not an attack force. 3 men wasn't an attack, not against 7. But it was a message. It was her father saying, "I know where you are, and I am done watching." Wyatt rode out to meet them before they reached the herd. She couldn't hear the exchange from where she was positioned, but she watched the body language of it. Wyatt relaxed in the saddle, not threatening but not moving either. The 3 riders pulling up at a distance that acknowledged his authority over this ground, one of them doing the talking while the other 2 sat their horses with the stillness of men who have been told exactly what to do and are waiting to be told to do it. The conversation lasted perhaps 4 minutes. Then the 3 riders turned and went back the way they'd come, and Wyatt came back to the herd. He came to her directly. He said, "That was Hicks." She said, "What did he want?" Wyatt said, "He brought a message from your father. Your father says that if you come back to the ranch today, he'll consider the matter of yesterday closed. He says there's no reason for this to involve anyone else." She stared at him. "And if I don't?" Wyatt said, "Then your father says he has people in Laramie County who will have questions for this outfit about the provenance of its cattle. He says he can make things very complicated very quickly for anyone who's standing between him and his daughter." She felt the familiar cold of it, the precision of her father's leverage, the way he had already mapped the angles and found the one that pressed hardest. Threatening Wyatt's outfit with a cattle provenance investigation was exactly the kind of thing her father would do. No violence, no visible wrongdoing on his part, just the application of pressure in the right place at the right time, creating problems for other people that they couldn't easily deny or disprove. She said, "He's trying to make you want to hand me over." Wyatt said, "I know." She said, "And?" He looked at her with that level gaze. He said, "I told Hicks to go back and tell your father that we'd be in Ridgecross in 2 days, and that if he had concerns about our cattle, he was welcome to take them up with the territorial marshal while we were there." She felt something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to it. She said, "You invited him to come argue with law." "More or less. He won't like that." "No," Wyatt said. "He won't." She looked out toward the tree line where the 3 riders had disappeared and thought about what her father would do with that answer. He would not like it. He would find it presumptuous and aggressive and probably insulting in the particular way that men like Caleb Mercer found it insulting when someone refused to be managed. He would go back to the ranch and sit in the study that still smelled of what had happened there, and he would think, and then he would decide. She said, "He'll come himself next time." Wyatt said, "I know." She said, "When he comes himself, he won't be sending a message." Wyatt said, "I know that too." He said it the same way he said everything, without drama, without bravado, just as a fact he had already accounted for and incorporated into whatever he was planning. She looked at him and thought about a man who had ridden into her father's ranch looking for evidence of something he had no obligation to pursue, who had broken down a door he had no authority to break down, who had told her father's hired man to bring his grievances to a federal marshal with the calm confidence of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. She thought about what it meant to be that kind of person. Not fearless. She didn't think he was fearless, but unwilling to let fear make the decisions. She wanted to say something. She wasn't sure what. In the end, she said nothing and turned her horse back to the left flank of the herd and worked the rest of the afternoon in the building wind. That night, camped on a flat stretch of grazed-over ground with good sight lines in all directions. Wyatt had chosen it deliberately, she realized. The way he chose everything, with purpose she only recognized after the fact. She sat with Burl after the others had turned in and watched him inventory the supply wagon by firelight. He handed her a strip of dried beef without being asked. She took it. He said, "You doing all right?" She said, "I'm upright." He said, "That's about all you can ask some days." She ate the dried beef and looked at the stars and said, "Burl, how long have you known Wyatt?" He said, 10 years, give or take, cooked for him since his second drive. She said, "What was he before this, before the cattle?" Burl was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's his story to tell, not mine." She said, "Fair enough." He said, "I'll say this much. He's a man who's seen things go wrong and decided he'd rather be the kind of person who does something about it than the kind who doesn't. Most people decide the other way. It's easier." He paused. Easier ain't always better. She thought about that. She thought about easier. About all the years of careful, quiet, careful, useful, invisible Evelyn, maintaining accounts and mending things and keeping the peace by pretending the peace existed. It had been easier. It had been so much easier than the alternative, and the alternative had still found her anyway, as it always does, in the end. She said, "No, it isn't." Burl closed the supply wagon and climbed down and stretched his back with a sound like a branch cracking. He said, "Try to sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long." She lay down and stared at the stars and thought about her father riding toward them through the Wyoming dark, calculating, methodical, running numbers that now included her in a column he had never intended. She thought about the door coming in. She thought about what comes after doors. Cole came back from Ridgecross the following afternoon riding harder than he'd left. Evelyn saw him first. She was on the left flank and had a clear line of sight north, and she recognized his horse before she could make out the rider clearly, recognized the particular lean of the animal coming at a pace that was not casual. She felt the back of her neck tighten and moved without thinking, cutting across the herd's path to find Wyatt at the point before Cole even pulled up. Wyatt had already seen him. He was waiting when Cole arrived, and he read Cole's face the way Evelyn was learning he read most things. Quickly, completely, without making a production of it, and said only, "Tell me." Cole said, "Aldridge got the notebook. He read it, and he wants to meet. But there's a problem." Wyatt said, "What kind?" Cole said, "The kind that has a name, man named Voss. Deputy out of Laramie County, been in that role about 4 years. Aldridge says he's been trying to build a case against him for 18 months. Thinks Voss has been feeding information to someone in the territory, someone running a protection arrangement for stolen stock. He can't prove it yet, but he's careful about it." Evelyn said, "Voss?" Both men looked at her. She said, "There's a V in my father's ledger. Not a full name, just an initial, same as the others. But it appears more than the rest. 12 times over 3 years, always in the column for what I always thought were legal fees or county assessments. Amounts between $20 and $60. Cole and Wyatt exchanged a look that communicated something she wasn't fully read into yet. Wyatt said, "So Aldridge's compromised deputy may be one of your father's people." "Maybe," she said. "The initial fits. The timing fits. I can't prove it from an initial." "No," Wyatt said. "But it means when we ride into Ridgecross, we need to be careful about who knows we're coming and what we're bringing." Cole said, "Aldridge said the same thing. He wants us to come in quiet. Not through the main road. There's a track east of town he described. Comes in behind the feed merchant. He'll meet us there after dark." Evelyn looked at the position of the sun and calculated. "That's tomorrow night if we push." "Yes," Wyatt said. She said, "And between now and then?" "Between now and then," Cole said, "we've got another problem." He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. This was waiting for me at the post relay station in Faber's Crossing, left there this morning by a rider heading south. He handed it to Wyatt, who unfolded it and read it. Then he handed it to Evelyn. The handwriting was her father's. She would have known it anywhere, the particular slant of it, the way he formed his letters with the same precision he applied to everything, neat and controlled and absolutely certain of itself. The message was short. It said, "The girl belongs at home. She is unwell and does not understand what she has seen. Return her and there will be no further difficulty for your outfit. Ignore this, and I will bury you alongside everything else I have buried. You have until nightfall tomorrow." She read it twice. She folded it and handed it back to Wyatt and said nothing. Wyatt said, "You all right?" She said, "He's accelerating. He said nightfall tomorrow. That means he's already moving. He didn't wait 3 days. You said 2 to 3. I said probably, she said. I said he was methodical. I was wrong about the timeline. He's more frightened than I calculated. Cole said, "Frightened men move faster and sloppier." Sometimes, she said, and sometimes frightened men who have spent 30 years making problems disappear just move faster. She looked out at the open ground around them. Good sight lines in daylight, less reassuring as she thought about what darkness would bring. He knows where we are. The scouts yesterday, and Hicks finding us today. He's had us tracked since we left the Double M. Wyatt said, "So tonight we can expect a visit." "I'd expect it," she said. "He won't wait for his own deadline. The deadline is for your benefit, not his. He's coming when he's ready." That information moved through the camp in the quiet way that Wyatt's outfit processed things, without theater, without panic, with the particular workmanlike seriousness of people who had decided that this was the situation and they were in it, and complaining about that fact didn't change the math. Decker checked his rifle twice and then a third time. The man named Rutherford, who had barely spoken to Evelyn since she'd joined them, came and asked her with blunt practicality whether she knew how to shoot. She said yes. He handed her a spare revolver without comment and went back to his post. She held the revolver and looked at it for a moment. It was heavier than she expected, or maybe she had just never held one with this particular purpose in mind before. Burl came past with coffee and said, without stopping, "Weight's in the grip. Point with your whole hand, not just your finger." She said, "Have you used one?" He said, "More than a cook should have to," and kept walking. Wyatt set the watch rotation early and doubled it, 2 men on at all times, positioned on opposite sides of the camp, with clear angles of sight across the ground they'd covered and the ground ahead. He didn't make a speech about it. He just arranged it and trusted that everyone understood why, which they did. He came to Evelyn after the arrangements were made and sat near her at the edge of the firelight. Not in it, just at the edge, where the darkness started. She had the revolver in her lap and the silver comb in her coat pocket, and she was doing what she had been doing for most of the past 2 days. Thinking. He said, "You should eat something." She said, "I'm not hungry." He said, "Doesn't matter." She looked at him. "Is that how you handle everything? Whether it matters or not, you do the practical thing?" He said, "Most of the time. Feelings are real, but they're not always useful." She said, "That sounds like something a man says who hasn't had to live by someone else's feelings his whole life." He took that without flinching, which she appreciated. He said, "That's fair." She looked back at the darkness beyond the camp. She said, "He's out there already. I can feel it. He rides at night sometimes. Used to, when I was small. Said the land looked different in the dark, and he liked knowing it both ways." She paused. "I thought that was interesting when I was 7. Now I just think it's useful information for someone who wants to approach a camp without being seen." Wyatt said, "Cole and Rutherford are good. They won't miss movement." She said, "My father has been moving things and people around this territory in the dark for 20 years. He's better at not being seen than most people are at looking." A pause. Then Wyatt said, "What are you afraid of, specifically?" She turned and looked at him. The question was direct enough that it caught her off guard. She had expected some version of reassurance and gotten something harder and more respectful than that. She said, "I'm afraid he'll say something that works, that he'll find the angle that gets through whatever I've built up since that bedroom, and I'll—" She stopped. "He's done it my whole life. Found the thing that moved me and used it. I'm afraid that when I see his face, some part of me will go back to being 11 years old and standing at my mother's grave and believing that he was the only solid thing left." Wyatt said, "But you know that's not true. She said, knowing something and feeling something aren't always in agreement. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, if he gets to you, if he says something and you feel yourself going, look at me. She looked at him now. He said, just look at me and remember that you lit a fire in a locked room and got yourself out. You did that, not me. I just opened the door. She held his gaze for a long time. She said, you did more than that. He said, not as much as you think. She didn't argue. She filed it away instead, the way she filed everything that mattered, carefully, in a place where she could find it again when she needed it. The attack came at 2 a.m, not the way she had imagined it, not a frontal approach, not a demand, not her father's voice in the dark, with its particular quality of patient authority. It came as sound first, Rutherford's voice saying something sharp and abbreviated, and then a shot, single and clear, and then everything was happening at once. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, revolver in hand, the weight of it suddenly exactly right rather than foreign, muscle memory from years of living on a working ranch taking over where conscious thought was still catching up. She came around the side of the wagon and found the camp in controlled chaos. Not panic. These were not men who panicked, but fast movement in all directions. Voices calling positions to each other in short, clipped exchanges that meant nothing to her but clearly meant everything to them. Cole was at the north edge of camp, down on one knee behind his saddle, trading fire with something in the darkness she couldn't yet see. Decker was east, moving wide to flank. Wyatt was, she turned and found him immediately, positioned between her and the south approach, and he looked at her and said, stay close to the wagon, in the same voice he used for everything. She said, how many? He said, at least 6, coming from the north and east. She said, my father will be south. He looked at her. She said, he never attacks from the front. He controls the exit. He'll be south, between us and the road to Ridgecross, waiting to see how it goes before he moves. Wyatt said, you're sure? She said, I know how he thinks. He made a decision in about 2 seconds. He said, then go south and flush him out. I'll cover you. She said, flush him? He wants you to come to him, Wyatt said. So let him think you are, but on your terms, not his. If he's south and he sees you moving toward him, he'll hold his position. He won't risk running before he knows if his men have this camp or not. She understood it. She understood it the way she understood the cattle, not by having been taught the specific theory, but by having lived near the reality long enough that the logic of it was built into her. She said, and you'll be behind me. Close enough, he said. She moved south. She moved deliberately, not hiding exactly, but not announcing herself either, the way you move when you want to be seen by the right person without advertising yourself to everyone. The sounds of the fight at the north and east edges of camp were loud enough to cover her movement. She went through the outer ring of firelight and into the darkness beyond it, and the darkness swallowed her, and she kept walking. She heard him before she saw him. The horse first, a soft blow of breath, the shift of hooves on dry ground. And then her eyes adjusted enough to make out the shape of him, 20 yards away, sitting his horse exactly where she had known he would be. Caleb Mercer, upright in the saddle, watching the camp with the patience of a man who has decided how things are going to go and is waiting for reality to catch up with his plan. She stopped. He hadn't seen her yet. She was downwind and the darkness was working for her. And she had maybe 30 seconds before that changed. She said, Papa. He turned. Fast. He had always been fast, faster than a man his age should be. He found her in the darkness, and there was a moment, just a moment, where something moved across his face that she recognized from childhood. It was not relief. It was something closer to the particular expression of a man who has calculated for several outcomes and is now identifying which one has arrived. He said, Evelyn. Not a greeting, more like confirmation. She said, call your men off. He said, come home. She said, that's not going to happen. He moved the horse forward, closing the distance between them by half, and she held her ground and let him come. He said, you don't understand what you've done, the people you've put in danger. These men, a gesture toward the camp, have no idea what they've walked into, what kind of trouble follows from this. She said, you mean the trouble you'll bring? You're describing your own actions as if they're weather. I'm describing consequence, he said. There's always consequence. Yes, she said. There is. He came closer still, and she could see his face properly now, the hard planes of it in the ambient darkness, and she had expected to feel the old fear. the reflexive, bone-deep response to his proximity that had been part of her biology since childhood. And she did feel it, the cold of it moving up through her chest. But underneath the cold was something new. Something that had been put there by 4 days of locked doors and cold cornbread, and a man who had decided his daughter was a problem to be managed, and it was harder than the fear, and it held its shape better. He said, "You were not supposed to see that. What happened with Pruitt? That was not something you were meant to carry." She said, "You killed a man. I protected this family." "There is no family," she said. "There hasn't been since Mama died. There's been you, and there's been me, and there's been the arrangement where I made myself useful enough that you kept me around. That's not family." His jaw tightened. She had seen that particular motion 10,000 times. She kept talking. She said, "I know what's in the ledgers. All of it, or enough of it. I've written it down. It's already in the hands of people who can use it. And calling your men off doesn't change that. It's already done, Papa. The only question now is whether you make this worse." He said, "You think a few pages of numbers is going to—" "I think Marshal Aldridge in Ridgecross has been building a case for 2 years," she said. "And I think what I gave him fills the gaps he was missing. And I think you already know that, which is why you came yourself instead of sending Hicks." The silence between them had a texture to it now. She could hear the gunfight at the north edge of camp still crackling, but it was thinning. Fewer exchanges, longer pauses, which meant either Wyatt's men were gaining the upper hand or they weren't, and she didn't know which, and she had to keep talking regardless. Her father said, "Your mother would be ashamed of what you're doing." She felt it hit. She had known it was coming, had known since she told Wyatt about the angles her father used, had identified this particular one as the most likely and the most dangerous. And she had prepared herself for it, and it hit anyway the way prepared for things always still hit, fully, in the soft place it was aimed at. She felt herself start to go somewhere, the 11-year-old standing at the grave, the girl who had built her entire existence around being useful to the one solid remaining thing. And she looked to her left and found Wyatt there. He had come up on her south side quiet as smoke, and he was just there, close enough that she could see his face, and he looked at her with that steady gaze and said nothing, just looked at her, and she remembered what he had said. "You lit a fire in a locked room and got yourself out. You did that." She turned back to her father. She said, "No, she wouldn't." Her father's expression shifted. Whatever he had expected, it wasn't that. She said, "Mama was careful and quiet, and she made herself small to keep the peace, and it wore her down. I watched it wear her down. I watched her choose smaller and smaller versions of herself until there was almost nothing left. And then the fever took what was left. And you stood at that grave like you were the one who'd lost something, like you were the one who'd been wronged." Her voice was level. She was surprised by how level it was. "She wouldn't be ashamed of me. She'd be relieved." Something happened in her father's face. She had never seen exactly this expression on him before. She had seen anger and contempt in the cold calculation, but this was different. This was something that looked almost like the crack in a wall before the wall comes down, something structural giving way under pressure it had held against for too long. He said, "You don't know what your mother—" "I know she cried when she thought you couldn't hear," Evelyn said. "I know I heard her through the wall when I was 9 years old, and I didn't understand what it meant until I was older. I know she told me once that the bravest thing a woman could do was want something for herself without apologizing for the wanting." She paused. "I was 10. I didn't know she was talking about herself." The gunfire to the north had stopped entirely. She could hear voices, Wyatt's men calling positions, the particular tone of men who have secured a situation rather than lost one. She heard Cole's voice clearly for a moment, and then it dropped back to something she couldn't make out. But the quality of the silence that followed was different from the silence of a fight still in progress. Her father heard it too. She watched him register it, watched the calculation run, watched him assess what the silence meant against the number of men he had sent and the number he had heard firing. And she watched him understand that the math had not gone the way he'd planned. He looked at her. She looked at him. 20 yards of Wyoming dark between them and 30 years of everything else. He said, "Come home, Evelyn." She said, "I don't have a home there anymore. I don't think I ever did." He moved. Not toward her. He had never been a man who charged at things directly, and he was not going to start now. He pulled the horse sideways, turning south, toward the open ground that represented distance and time and the possibility of regrouping, and his hand went to the revolver at his hip, not drawing it, not yet, just resting there, and Evelyn understood with a cold clarity that he was deciding whether to go or whether to end this differently. Wyatt said, "Mercer." Her father stopped. He looked at Wyatt. Wyatt said, "The notebook is already with Aldridge. Sending men to this camp tonight was the last decision you could have made that might have stayed quiet. You just made it visible instead." He paused. "Ride back to the Double M. Whatever you need to handle before federal marshals arrive on your doorstep, you've got maybe 4 days to handle it. That's the only thing I'm willing to give you." Her father looked at him for a long moment. He looked at Evelyn. She could not read his face anymore. It had gone behind something she didn't have language for, the final retreat of a man who has run every calculation and found that none of them work. He said, "She's still my daughter." Wyatt said, "Yes, and she's still standing here by her own choice. That's the difference." Her father turned the horse and rode south, and the darkness absorbed him. She listened to the hoofbeats until she couldn't hear them anymore, and then she listened to the silence where they had been. Wyatt came and stood beside her. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, which was the right thing. After a while, she said, "Is everyone all right?" He said, "One of mine took a graze on the arm. Nothing serious. 2 of his men are down. Not dead, just not going anywhere fast. Hicks and 2 others ran when they heard the South was quiet." She said, "The ones who are down, what happens to them?" "We'll hand them to Aldridge and Ridgecross," he said. "They're part of the operation. They'll have information worth giving." She nodded. She thought about Hicks, 11 years, her father's most loyal man, the one who had said yes, sir, and boarded windows without asking why, riding south in the dark and deciding at some point in the next few days whether loyalty had a limit. She found she didn't have strong feelings about it either way. She was too tired for additional feelings. She said, "He'll go back to the ranch." "For now," Wyatt said. "He won't run. He doesn't run. He'll go back and he'll think and he'll decide that everything can still be managed if he moves fast enough and smart enough." She paused. "He's wrong, but he'll think it." Wyatt said, "Let him think it while we ride to Ridgecross." She said, "He'll try to get to the marshal before we do. Discredit the notebook, discredit me." "Aldridge already has the notebook," Wyatt said. "And I've known Aldridge for 6 years. Your father has reach, but not that kind of reach." She turned and looked at him. She said, "You keep saying that you know Aldridge, that Aldridge is straight. How well do you know him?" He said, "Well enough." She said, "Wyatt." He met her eyes. Something passed between them that was more complicated than the moment had room for. And she filed it away for later the way she had been filing things all week, in the place where everything she needed to understand about this man was accumulating faster than she could properly process it. He said, "I did some work for Aldridge a few years back, informal. He was trying to trace stolen stock across county lines, and he needed someone who could move through ranch country without drawing attention. Trail bosses go a lot of places without anyone asking why." She said, "So you've been working with the marshal?" "Not officially," he said. "Not on any paper. Just when something came up that he needed eyes on, and I happened to be in the right place." She thought about that. She said, "And Clement Briggs, and my father's ranch. That was one of those things. Aldridge pointed me that direction, yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You could have told me that earlier." He said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you?" He looked at her steadily. He said, "Because I didn't want you to think you'd been helped into a situation rather than out of one. You made every decision you made because you chose to. I didn't want to complicate that." She thought about it from every angle she could find. Then she said, "It doesn't complicate it. I saw what I saw in that study. I made smoke. I made noise. I got out. Nobody put me in your path. That was just what happened." He said, "Exactly." She said, "But I appreciate you saying so." They walked back to the camp together, not speaking. Burl had coffee going already. She was genuinely unsure when Burl slept, or whether he did. And Decker was telling somebody about the flanking move he'd made at the east edge in a voice that was trying to sound casual and wasn't quite achieving it. Rutherford was wrapping his own arm with the economical self-sufficiency of a man who has had to do this before and considers it an inconvenience rather than a crisis. Cole came to Wyatt and said, "We're clear. The two I've got tied won't be walking fast for a while. Hicks and the others are gone. He looked at Evelyn. Your father? She said, gone south. Cole said, he'll regroup. She said, yes. Cole said, then we need to be in Ridgecross before he does. They broke camp before dawn, moving by starlight across ground that had, an hour ago, been full of gunfire and was now just ground again, indifferent to what had happened on it. The cattle were unsettled from the noise and needed steady handling, and Evelyn worked the left flank on automatic, her body doing the job while her mind was somewhere else entirely, running and rerunning the conversation with her father, looking for what she might have said differently or better, and finding, to her own surprise, that there wasn't much. She had said what was true. She had said what she should have said years ago and hadn't, because the cost had been too high, and she had been too young and too frightened and too convinced that survival required accommodation. The cost had found her anyway, around mid-morning with Ridgecross. Theoretically a half-day's push ahead of them and the sky clear and cold above the Wyoming grass, Decker rode up alongside her and said, in the manner of someone who had been thinking about how to say something for a while, that was something last night, what you did. She said, I talked to my father. He said, you stood there in the dark and talked to him while we were getting shot at from the other side. That's something. She said, I was scared out of my mind the whole time. He said, well, yeah, that's usually how it works. She looked at him. His perpetually worried face was doing something different today. Still worried, but also something more like respect. She said, you always look like something bad is about to happen. He said, something usually is. She said, does that bother you? He considered it seriously. He said, not as much as it used to. You get used to reading it and dealing with it, and it stops being scary and starts being just the thing you do. She thought about that for a long time. The thing you do. Not heroism, not even bravery exactly, just the repeated decision to read what's in front of you and respond to it instead of freezing. She had done it in the locked room. She had done it the night before. She was still doing it now, and the sky was not falling, and her father was behind her, and Ridgecross was ahead, and the cattle were moving, and everything terrible, and everything that mattered were still somehow in motion simultaneously. She thought about what Aldridge would say when they arrived, what questions he would ask, what the notebook would mean in the hands of someone with actual authority to use it. She thought about the name Voss, the compromised deputy, the initial in her father's ledger, and what Aldridge's awareness of that problem meant for how they would have to approach the meeting. She thought about her father riding south through the pre-dawn dark, going back to the ranch that had his name on it and his dead wife in the ground behind it, and 23 years of his particular version of hard work built into every fence post and roof beam. She thought about him sitting in the study. She thought about what he would decide. And she thought, not comfortably, not without cost, but with the same cold clarity that had seen her through locked doors and smoke and gunfire and a conversation in the dark that had said everything that needed to be said. That whatever he decided, she would be ready for it. The thing you do. She straightened in the saddle and looked north toward Ridgecross and rode. Ridgecross arrived the way most things arrived on the frontier, without ceremony, just suddenly there. When you crested the right rise, a cluster of buildings pressed against the earth like they were trying not to be noticed by the sky above them. Wyatt had them take the eastern track Cole had described, coming in behind the feed merchants as instructed, the cattle lowing with the particular irritation of animals who had been moved hard and wanted to stop. The town was quiet in the way that small towns are quiet at dusk, not empty, just drawn inward, lights beginning in windows, the smell of wood smoke and cooked food drifting on the cold air. Marshal Aldridge was waiting where he said he would be. Evelyn had built a picture of him in her head during the ride north, assembled from what Wyatt had said and hadn't said, and the picture had been of someone imposing, large, deliberate, the kind of presence that filled a room the way her father's presence filled a room, by sheer accumulated authority. The man who stepped out from behind the feed merchant's back wall was medium height, narrow-shouldered, with a gray mustache and the kind of face that had done a great deal of listening over many years and showed it. He looked at Wyatt and nodded. He looked at Evelyn for a longer moment with eyes that were neither warm nor hostile, just attentive, taking inventory the way Wyatt took inventory, though the quality of it was different, more forensic. He said, "Miss Mercer." She said, "Marshall." He said, "I've read your notebook twice." She said, "And?" He said, and I want you to walk me through it in person. Every entry, every amount, every name or initial you can put to a transaction. Tonight, if you're able." She said, "I'm able." Wyatt said, "We need to talk about Voss first." Aldridge's expression didn't change, which itself was a kind of answer. He said, "Come inside." The back room of the feed merchant turned out to be someone's office. A desk, 4 chairs, a lamp that needed trimming and smelled of it, a window with an oilcloth tacked over it. Aldridge had clearly been using this space for some time. There were papers stacked on the desk with the organized density of documents that were being worked rather than stored, and a coffee pot on the small iron stove in the corner that was warm when Evelyn put her hand near it, meaning he'd been here a while before they arrived. He sat behind the desk. Wyatt took the chair to the left. Evelyn sat across from Aldridge directly, which felt right. This was her testimony, her information, her decision to bring it here, and she was not going to arrange herself at a remove from the center of it. Cole stood near the door. Aldridge said, "Voss? What do you know about him?" Evelyn said, "An initial only. V, recurring in my father's ledger over 3 years, 12 appearances, amounts between $20 and $60, recorded in a column that my father labeled as county fees and legal assessments. But when I checked those amounts against the county assessor records, I had access to those through the household correspondence. None of them matched anything billed to the double M in those periods." Aldridge said, "So, payments to someone, recorded as official fees to avoid scrutiny?" "Yes. Routine enough in the books that anyone doing a casual review would accept them. Only someone who knew to cross-reference the actual county billing records would notice the discrepancy." Aldridge looked at her for a moment. He said, "Most people wouldn't know to cross-reference the actual county billing records." She said, "I kept the household accounts. I knew what everything cost. When something didn't match, I noticed." He said, "But you didn't say anything." "No," she said, and she said it without flinching, because the honest answer was the only answer that would serve here. "I noticed, and I filed it, and I didn't ask, because asking my father questions about his books was not something that ended well. I was careful. I made choices about what to see and what not to see, and I'm not proud of that, but it's the truth." Aldridge studied her. She let him. She had the feeling he was very good at knowing when someone was performing honesty versus producing it, and she had nothing to perform. He said, "Voss has been in my county for 4 years. I have suspected him for 18 months of feeding information to someone who was using it to stay ahead of my investigations. 3 times I came close to building a case against an operation in this territory, and 3 times the people I was building it against seemed to know I was coming before I arrived." He paused. "Your notebook gives me specific dates. If I can place Voss in contact with your father or your father's intermediaries on or around those dates." "There's something else," Evelyn said. He waited. She said, "The entry from 14 months ago, October 3rd week, $60, the largest single payment in the V column. 2 weeks after that, my father received a letter. He didn't show it to me, but I saw the envelope before he burned it, and the postmark was from this county. That was the same period where—" She stopped and looked at Wyatt. Wyatt said, "The Briggs cattle." Aldridge looked between them. Evelyn said, "Clement Briggs reported 200 head stolen 14 months ago. There's an entry in my father's ledger, $312 received, no source, that same month. If your investigation into the Briggs theft came close to the double M around that time and then suddenly went cold." Aldridge sat back in his chair. It was not a relaxed movement. It was the movement of a man absorbing information that was confirming something he had suspected and hated that he'd suspected. He said, "The Briggs investigation went cold in November of that year. The trail just stopped. Evidence that should have been there wasn't. A witness who had agreed to speak with me changed his account." His jaw was tight. $60. Evelyn said, "I'm sorry." He said, "Don't be. You didn't do it." He straightened and pulled a paper from the stack on the desk. "Here's the problem. Voss knows you're in this town. I didn't tell him. I told no one except the 2 deputies I trust completely. But your father has known your general direction for days, and if Voss has been feeding him information, the odds are good that he knows you've made contact with me." Cole said, from the door, "Which means Mercer knows." "Yes," Aldridge said. Wyatt said, "How long before Mercer could get men to Ridgecross?" Depends on when he got the information, Aldridge said. Could be tomorrow morning, could be tonight if he moved fast. He looked at Evelyn. You said your father doesn't act without information, but he has the information now. She said, he also knows the notebook exists. He knows I've given it to you. She thought about her father's face in the dark outside the camp, the thing that had given way underneath the calculation. He has one move left that changes anything. He has to discredit me before I can testify formally. Aldridge said, or he runs. She shook her head. He won't run. The ranch is everything he has, 23 years. He will not walk away from it. Then he comes here, Aldridge said, or he tries to take me off the board before you can put my testimony in front of a federal judge. She said it plainly, because the plainness of it was the only way to deal with it, which means the next 24 hours matter more than anything else. Aldridge nodded slowly. He said, I'm going to need you to write a formal statement tonight. Everything in the notebook, plus everything you observed, plus the conversation you had with your father at the camp 2 nights ago. All of it, signed and witnessed. He looked at Wyatt. I'll need your account of the camp attack as well. The 2 men your outfit has in custody need to be transferred to my jail tonight. Wyatt said, done. Aldridge said, and I need to deal with Voss before morning, or everything we're building here has a hole in it. He said it grimly, not with pleasure. She had the sense that the prospect of confronting a corrupt deputy was not something he relished, that it sat in him the way bad medicine sits, necessary, awful, taken because the alternative was worse. She said, is there anything I can do to help with that? He looked at her. He said, you've already done the most important part. She wrote for 3 hours. Aldridge sat across from her and asked questions, and she answered them, and he wrote notes alongside what she was producing, cross-referencing, building the architecture of a legal case out of the raw material of her memory. Her hand cramped around the middle of the 2nd hour, and she switched the pencil to her left hand for a few minutes and kept writing, because stopping felt like giving something up that she wasn't willing to give. Wyatt sat in the corner of the room most of that time, not hovering, just present. Once he brought her coffee without being asked. Once she looked up from the page and found him looking at her with an expression she had no immediate name for, something that was partly the careful assessment she'd learned to recognize and partly something else underneath it, something quieter and less categorizable. She looked back at her paper and kept writing. Around midnight, there was a sound from outside. Raised voices, briefly, and then the sound of a door being opened and closed with force. Aldridge stood up and was at the door before any of them had fully registered the sound, his hand on his revolver, and Cole was right behind him. They came back 2 minutes later. Aldridge's expression had the quality of something settled, not pleasantly, but definitively. He said, Voss has been relieved of his badge and is currently in my jail. He said it the way you report weather. He had a letter on him, ready to send, addressed to the double M. Evelyn said, what did it say? Aldridge set a folded piece of paper on the desk in front of her. She opened it and read it, and her throat tightened. It described, in careful detail, the contents of her notebook, the meeting at the feed merchant's back office, the names of Wyatt's men, and the 2 prisoners transferred to Aldridge's jail. It was thorough and accurate, and it had been written with the kind of attention to detail that only came from access. She said, he was in this building. Aldridge said, he had no reason to be here tonight. He knew that. He came anyway because someone wanted this information badly enough that Voss was willing to risk being seen. She said, my father. Your father, Aldridge agreed. He took the letter back and folded it. This is actually helpful. It documents the relationship directly. It's evidence. He said it with the grim satisfaction of a man finding something useful in a bad situation. The question is what your father does now that his line of information has gone quiet. She knew the answer, and she thought Aldridge probably knew it too, but she said it anyway because saying things plainly had become, over the last 4 days, the only mode she trusted. She said, he comes himself. When Voss doesn't send the letter and doesn't report back, my father will understand that something has gone wrong on this end. He won't wait to find out what. He'll move. Aldridge said, then we need to be ready for him. What being ready looked like, in Aldridge's practical assessment, was this. Evelyn's formal statement completed and witnessed before dawn, a copy made and locked in the marshal's strongbox, and another copy sent with a rider to the federal court in Cheyenne before first light. Wyatt's testimony regarding the attack on the camp, also completed and witnessed. The two prisoners from the attack formally charged and their statements taken. Aldridge sent a deputy for that immediately, understanding that frightened men who have been caught sometimes talk when they're not given time to think about whether talking serves their interests. Evelyn finished her statement at 1:30 in the morning. Aldridge read it in full, asked 4 clarifying questions, made 2 small notations in the margin, and then slid it across to her for a final review. She read it. Every word of it, slowly, because this document was the shape of everything she had witnessed and endured and survived put into legal language, and it deserved that. She signed it. Aldridge signed as witness. Wyatt signed as second witness. Cole signed as third. She set the pencil down and looked at her name on the paper and thought, there it is. Evelyn Mercer, the thing that cannot be taken back. Good. Wyatt said, how do you feel? She said, tired. He said, that's honest. She said, I've been practicing. He almost smiled. The almost smile again, that crease at the corner of his mouth that implied more than it showed. She was beginning to think that was simply his face, that the full smile was something he rationed, kept for occasions that had genuinely earned it, which she respected even as part of her was curious about what those occasions looked like. Aldridge said, I'm going to suggest you don't stay in town tonight. If Mercer is moving toward Ridgecross, being inside the town limits puts civilians in the middle of whatever happens. Wyatt said, we'll camp east of town, close enough to reach you fast if needed. Aldridge said, I'll have 2 deputies with you. Wyatt said, 4 would be better. Aldridge looked at him for a moment. Then he said, 4 it is. They rode east of town in the dark, Wyatt's outfit plus 4 of Aldridge's deputies, and set up a camp that Evelyn noticed immediately was arranged differently from their trail camps, tighter, with the wagon positioned as a physical barrier on the south side and the horses closer in, and the watch rotation set at 3 men rather than 2. She didn't comment on it. She understood what it meant. They were not moving cattle anymore. They were waiting for something specific. She slept for perhaps 2 hours, which was more than she expected. She woke to the pre-dawn gray and the sound of the fire being rebuilt, and lay still for a moment, cataloging the sounds of the camp the way she had learned to do. This sound normal, that sound normal, nothing out of register, and found everything in order. She got up and went to the fire and found Wyatt already there. He handed her coffee. She took it. They stood without speaking for a few minutes, which was comfortable in a way that surprised her. She had not had many silences in her life that felt like rest rather than waiting. She said, what time do you think he'll come? He said, if he rode through the night, early morning. If he waited for daylight. He looked at the sky, calculating. Couple hours. She said, when this is over. She stopped. He looked at her. She said, when this is finished and the testimony is with the federal court and my father is, when it's done, what happens to your outfit? He said, we finish the cattle drive, another week to Cheyenne, weather depending, collect payment, rest the men, plan the next one. She said, and you? He said, same thing I always do. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. She said, I don't have anywhere to go after this. She said it plainly, not fishing for anything, just stating a fact that needed to be stated. I have $42 and the clothes I'm wearing and a silver comb. Whatever my father has, the ranch, whatever money, I don't know what happens to that through a legal proceeding. It could be years before anything is settled. He said, Cheyenne's a real town, bigger than anything in this part of the territory. You could find work there. You can keep accounts. You can manage a household operation. You can ride and handle cattle. That's not nothing. She said, no, it isn't. He said, Cole's sister runs a boarding house in Cheyenne. Clean, reasonable, safe. He could ride ahead. She looked at him. She said, you've thought about this. He said, some. She said, when? He said, on the ride north. And before that. She held his gaze. How much before that? He said, since about the time I heard your voice through the smoke. She was quiet for a moment. She said, that's a strange time to start planning someone's future. He said, I wasn't planning your future. I was just... He stopped, looked into the fire. I heard you in that room and I thought, whoever is in there has decided not to stop, and I wanted to know what that person did next. She thought about that. She thought about herself in that locked room with the oil tin and the matches, making the calculation that smoke was better than silence, that noise was better than waiting, that an uncertain outcome was better than a certain one. She thought about what it felt like to make that choice, the terror of it, the clarity underneath the terror. She said, I want to know what I do next too. He looked at her then, properly, the full weight of that steady attention, and something in it was different from all the times he had looked at her before. Not more intense exactly, but more present, she thought, like he had stopped holding some part of himself at a remove and let it close the distance. He said, whatever it is, it'll be something. She said, that's not a very specific prediction. He said, no, but I mean it. She believed him. She was not sure she had believed many people in her life without reservation, had always maintained a careful accounting of what each person's words were worth and what they were likely to cost her, but she believed this with a directness that bypassed the accounting entirely. And she noticed that, filed it away, and let it be. The attack came at 7 in the morning, with the sun fully up and the Wyoming sky its characteristic clean and pitiless blue. Her father did not come quietly. She had thought he might, had thought the daylight and the presence of law and the failed nighttime assault on the camp might have recalibrated something in him, might have introduced the kind of doubt that slows a man down. But Caleb Mercer had spent 23 years building something, and it was all coming apart, and whatever doubt he felt was apparently not sufficient to slow him below a hard gallop. He came with 7 men. She counted them as they crested the rise to the west. 7 riders, her father at the center, and she recognized the shapes of 2 of the men she had expected and 3 she hadn't, which meant he had called in people from beyond the usual payroll, had reached into whatever reserves the operation had and pulled men she had never seen at the Double M, which told her something about how frightened he was and how certain he was that this was his last chance. Aldridge's 4 deputies spread out along the north side of the camp. Wyatt's men took the south and east. Cole positioned himself at the wagon with a rifle, which he handled with a matter-of-fact competence that suggested extensive prior familiarity. Wyatt came to stand beside Evelyn. She said, I should go out to him. He said, no. She said, Wyatt, if I go out to him, there's a chance he stops. If he rides into this camp with 7 men, there will be shooting and people will get hurt and, he said, Evelyn. She looked at him. He said, you have already done what needed to be done. Your name is on that paper and it's in Aldridge's strongbox, and there is a rider halfway to Cheyenne right now. You standing in front of your father changes nothing about those facts and puts you in the line of fire. She said, he's my father. He said, I know. She said, I have to try. He looked at her for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then he said, I'll be right behind you. She walked out. She walked out of the camp and into the open ground between the wagon and the approaching riders and stopped there, alone, in the morning light, and waited for her father to see her. He saw her. He pulled up, and his men pulled up around him, and there was a moment of absolute stillness that felt like the whole landscape was holding its breath. She said, Papa, stop. He looked at her from horseback, and she could see his face clearly in the morning light in a way she hadn't been able to see it in the dark 2 nights ago, and what she saw frightened her. Not the calculation was still there, would always be there, was built into him so deep it was structural. But underneath it was something she had not expected, something raw and unmanaged and completely out of character for a man who prided himself on managing everything. He said, step away from them. She said, I can't do that. He said, you are my daughter. She said, and I've given a formal statement to a federal marshal. It's already in Cheyenne. There's nothing you can do now that changes that. Coming here with 7 men doesn't unwrite what I've written. It only adds to it. He said, come home, Evelyn. He said it differently this time. The business voice was gone, the patient authority was gone, and what was left underneath was something she had not heard from him since she was very small. Something tired and almost broken. Just come home. She felt it. She had known she would feel it. The 11-year-old at the grave, the girl who had wanted so badly for the solid remaining thing to be solid, to be something she could lean against. She felt all of it, and she stood in it, and she did not move. She said, I can't come home. There isn't a home there anymore. Whatever there was, whatever we were to each other, you ended it the moment you put a lock on that door. He said, I was protecting... You were protecting yourself, she said. You have always been protecting yourself. I was just part of what you were protecting it from. His jaw worked. She watched it. She said, surrender to Marshal Aldridge. Right now, this morning. It won't undo what you've done, but it will end this, and you'll be alive. And there will be a proceeding where you can tell your side of it. That's all that's left." He said nothing. Behind her, she heard Aldridge's voice, steady and official. "Caleb Mercer, you are under warrant for the murder of Jonas Pruitt and multiple counts of criminal conspiracy. Surrender your weapons and dismount." Her father looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze. She did not look away. Then he looked at the camp, at Aldridge's deputies, at Wyatt's men, at Cole with the rifle, at the whole arranged weight of the situation he had ridden into. And he ran the calculation one final time, and something in his face concluded. He reached for his revolver. Not at her. She would think about this later, would return to it, the fact that his hand went sideways toward Aldridge, the instinctive move of a man whose threat was law rather than his own blood. But the movement itself triggered everything at once, the way these moments always do, all the waiting and the tension releasing in a single instant. The shot that stopped him came from Cole. Single, precise, from the rifle at the wagon. Her father's arm dropped and the revolver went with it, and he swayed in the saddle, and two of his men grabbed him before he fell, and the other five were already reading what had happened and making the decision that men make when the numbers stop working, the decision to live through this rather than for it. They surrendered. One by one, the weapons came down. Evelyn stood in the open ground and watched Aldridge's deputies move forward, and she heard her father's voice saying something she couldn't make out, and she stood very still until Wyatt came and stood beside her. He said quietly, "You all right?" She said, "Is he—" "Arm shot," Wyatt said. "He'll live." She let out a breath. She had not known how much she had been holding until it was out. She said, "I didn't want him dead." He said, "I know." She said, "I know what he is. I know everything he's done. And I still—" She stopped. He said, "That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." She looked at him. She said, "I don't know what to do with that." He said, "You don't have to do anything with it right now." She looked back at the scene ahead of her. Her father being helped down from his horse, his men being collected and secured, Aldridge moving through it all with the same narrow-shouldered, efficient authority she had observed the night before. She looked at it the way you look at something you have been moving toward for a long time and have finally reached, with a mixture of relief and the strange disorientation of arrival. It was over, or this part of it was over. There would be proceedings and testimony and lawyers and the slow machinery of territorial justice working through everything she had written and witnessed and signed her name to. There would be decisions about the ranch and the money and the network of people her father had built and what happened to all of them when the structure collapsed. There would be months of it, possibly years of it, and none of it would be clean or quick or without cost. But this part, the running and the smoke and the locked door and the dark conversations and the shooting and the morning light, this part was over. Aldridge came to her after her father was secured. He said, "The wound is manageable. He'll stand trial." She said, "Good." He said, "The men he brought, 3 of them I recognize from prior investigations. They'll have things to say when they understand the situation they're in." She said, "They usually do." He looked at her with that inventory expression. He said, "You did well, Miss Mercer. What you brought me, the specificity of it, the memory for detail, that is going to matter enormously in what comes next." She said, "I kept accounts because it was what I was useful for. I never thought useful would mean this." He said, "Useful means whatever you make it mean." He held out his hand. She shook it. It was a firm handshake, the kind that meant something. She turned and walked back to the camp where Burl had, inevitably, made coffee, where Decker was retelling the morning's events in a voice that was still not quite achieving casual, where Cole was talking quietly with 2 of the deputies about logistics, where the whole functioning organism of this outfit that had absorbed her 5 days ago and adjusted around her presence was doing the thing it always did, which was to continue, to manage the next thing, to keep moving. She poured herself coffee. She drank it. Wyatt came and stood near her, not touching, just near, the way he was near things he wanted to keep an eye on without making a show of it. She said, "Cole's sister's boarding house." He said, "In Cheyenne." She said, "Is it a real recommendation, or were you just thinking of something to say?" He said, "Everything I say is real." She looked at him. She believed that too. And with the same uncomplicated directness, the same bypassing of the careful accounting, She said, "Then yes. If Cole's willing to write ahead." He said, "He's willing. I already asked him." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "When did you ask him?" He said, "Yesterday morning." She said, "You were that certain?" He said, "I was that hopeful." A pause. There's a difference. She thought about the difference. She thought about hope as something distinct from certainty. Lighter, more honest, less armored. She had not had much practice with hope as a standalone thing, had usually needed it shored up by certainty before she trusted it. But she was beginning to think that certainty was something you built after the fact, and hope was what you operated on in the meantime. She said, "All right." She said it simply, without elaboration, because it was enough. He nodded. The almost smile, the crease at the corner of his mouth. They stood in the morning light and drank their coffee, and to the west her father was being helped into a wagon bound for Aldridge's jail, and to the north Ridgecross sat quiet and ordinary against the Wyoming sky, and the cattle that had been the beginning of all this were grazing peacefully on the east side of the camp, as if none of it had anything to do with them, which in the most important sense was true. Evelyn put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the silver comb, the engraved roses, the weight of it that was familiar in the way that very old things are familiar. Not comfortable exactly, but known, stitched into the fabric of who she was before she understood who she was going to be. She held it, and she looked at the sky, and she thought about Cheyenne, and what came next, and what useful might mean when you were the one who got to decide. The ride to Cheyenne took 6 days. Not because the distance required it, Wyatt's outfit had made faster time on harder ground, but because 3 days out of Ridgecross. The weather came down off the mountains with the particular seriousness of early October in Wyoming, and moving 300 head of cattle through sideways sleet on ground that was turning from hard-packed dirt to something closer to cold mud, was the kind of work that set its own pace, regardless of what anyone wanted. Evelyn worked the left flank through most of it, because the left flank was where she had started, and it had become, without ceremony or formal designation, her place in the operation. Nobody had assigned it to her. Nobody had taken it away. It was simply where she was, and the outfit had organized itself around it the same way it organized itself around everything, pragmatically, without sentiment, because it worked. She had time to think in those 6 days. More time than she entirely wanted. The formal proceedings against her father had begun before they left Ridgecross. Aldridge had been thorough and fast about it. She suspected that 18 months of frustrated investigation had produced in him a capacity for speed that ordinary circumstances didn't require. And by the morning they broke camp east of town, warrants had been issued, the 2 men Cole had captured at the trail camp had given statements that corroborated the notebook's account in 3 specific and legally useful ways, and a federal circuit judge in Cheyenne had been notified that testimony was incoming on a criminal conspiracy case that touched 4 counties. Her father was in Aldridge's jail with a bandaged arm, and reportedly, very little to say. Aldridge had told her this when he came to see them off. She had asked how her father seemed, and Aldridge had paused in the particular way of a man choosing honest over kind and said, "Contained. Whatever he's feeling, he's not showing it." She had nodded. She had thought, of course. He would go behind the calculation the same way he always went behind the calculation, and he would sit in that jail and think and manage and remain impossible to read until the moment he decided what he wanted the next thing to look like. Even now. Even with everything collapsed around him, Caleb Mercer would not simply feel his way through a situation. He would think his way through it and arrive at the far side of it having decided something, and whatever he had decided would be controlled and deliberate and difficult to reach. She had thought about that for a long time on the trail, in the sleet and the cold, and the company of cattle who did not care about her internal state at all, which was actually a relief. She had thought about what it meant to be the daughter of a man like that, to have grown up in the shadow of that particular kind of control, to have learned the shape of the world from someone who believed that everything could be managed if you were smart enough and ruthless enough and willing to do what was necessary. She had learned some of that. She understood numbers and patterns and the architecture of how things fit together. She understood patience and the strategic deployment of silence. She understood how to read a situation and position herself relative to it. What she had not learned from him, what she had learned despite him, or after him, or in the last 8 days of smoke and locked doors and gunfire and honest conversation by firelight, was that managing things and living things were not the same activity. That the kind of control her father prized was not strength, but the performance of strength by a man who was afraid that the real version might not hold. She thought about her mother crying through the wall. She thought about a woman who had wanted something for herself without apologizing for the wanting and had never quite managed it, had made herself smaller and smaller until there wasn't enough of her left to sustain itself. She thought about lighting the oil tin, about the specific decision to make smoke instead of waiting quietly, to fill the room with something undeniable, to create a situation that could not be ignored. She thought, that was the first time in my life I did something that was entirely mine. She wanted more of those. The sleet broke on the fourth day, and the sun came back with that particular clarity that follows hard weather on the high plains, the kind of light that made everything look cleaned and exact. The cattle moved better. The mood of the outfit lifted in the collective way that moods lift when weather improves, and the work becomes easier, not dramatic, just a general settling towards something more like ordinary. Decker rode alongside her that afternoon and talked for 20 minutes about a horse he wanted to buy in Cheyenne, a gray he had heard about from another drover, and she listened and asked questions and found herself genuinely interested in the gray horse's particular qualities, which told her something about how she was feeling that she might not have been able to say directly. When you start caring about a stranger's horse, you have arrived somewhere on the far side of crisis. She said, "Do you like this work, truly?" He said, "What, droving?" She said, "All of it. The trail, the cattle, all of it." He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated about him. He always thought about things seriously, even when the question didn't seem to require it. He said, "Yeah, most of it. Some days are just miserable and you're cold and the cattle are being ornery and everything hurts. But most of it, yeah. I like knowing where I am in it. I like that the job is clear." She said, "The job is clear." He said, "You know what you're supposed to do and you do it and you can tell whether you did it right. Not everything's like that." She thought about that. She said, "No, most things aren't." He said, "What are you going to do in Cheyenne?" She said, "I don't know yet. Something with numbers, probably. I'm good with numbers." He said, "Wyatt said you kept your father's books." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you ran a whole household." She said, "Yes." He looked at her with the worried face doing the respect thing again. He said, "There's ranchers in Cheyenne who would pay good money for someone who can do both those things and also handle cattle." She said, "I'm not going back to working for a rancher." He said, "Fair enough." She said, "I think I want something that's mine." She said it out loud for the first time, and the saying of it clarified something. "I don't know what yet, but something where I'm not useful to someone else's thing, where the books are mine." He nodded. He said, "That sounds right for you." She looked at him. "You barely know me." He said, "I've watched you work a left flank for 6 days in bad weather without complaining, and then write formal testimony at midnight, and then stand in open ground in front of armed men and talk. I know you well enough." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Decker." He said, "Sure," and went back to worrying about the gray horse, which was the right way to end the conversation. Cheyenne appeared on the afternoon of the 6th day, sprawling and substantial in a way that surprised her, even though she had known intellectually that it was a real city, a territorial capital, something categorically different from the ranch land and small-town crossroads that had constituted her entire geography until now. Buildings of real brick. Streets that had been graded and maintained. The sound of it. Voices and wagons and commerce and all the noise of a place that had committed to existing rolled out to meet them before they could properly see it. Wyatt had arrangements for the cattle outside the city proper, a stockyard south of town where the herd would be held and sold, which was the business conclusion of the drive she had joined midstream. She watched the cattle go into the yard with the particular feeling of watching something end that had been, despite everything, a kind of structure. The cattle had been constant. The work of them had been constant. She was going to miss that more than she expected. Cole's sister's boarding house was on a street called Garfield, which was wide and tree-lined in a way that suggested the town's aspirations. And the house itself was 2 stories of white-painted wood, with a porch that needed repainting but was clean, and the windows were bright. Cole's sister was a woman named Margaret, who was taller than Cole and looked like she had been dealing with impractical situations for most of her adult life, and had developed a personal policy of simply addressing them. She opened the door before they knocked, which suggested she had been watching from the window, and she looked at Evelyn and said, "You're Evelyn Mercer." Evelyn said, "Yes." Margaret said, "My brother rode ahead. Come in. I've got a room on the second floor with a window that faces east. Good light in the mornings. You look like someone who could use good light in the mornings." Evelyn said, "That's very specific of you." Margaret said, "I've run a boarding house for 9 years. I know what people need by looking at them." She stepped back to let Evelyn in. Then she looked at Wyatt, who was standing slightly behind, and said, "You look terrible." Wyatt said, "Thank you, Margaret." She said, "Come in and eat something, both of you." The room on the second floor was small and clean, and the window did face east, and Margaret had not been lying about the light. The next morning it came in clear and cold and substantial, and Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed in it for 10 minutes before she did anything else, just sat in the light and breathed. She was in Cheyenne. She was alive. Her name was on a formal legal document in a federal marshal's possession. Her father was in a jail cell in Ridgecross, waiting for a circuit court date that Aldridge had said would come within 2 months. She had $42 and the clothes she was wearing and a silver comb and a room that faced east. She thought, start there. The legal proceedings moved in the way that legal proceedings move, which is to say, slowly and then all at once. A federal circuit judge named Harlan sent a representative to Cheyenne within the first week to take Evelyn's formal testimony, which was a 3-hour process conducted in a law office on the main street and which required her to recount everything she had written and then answer questions about it for what felt like most of the morning. She answered everything she was asked. She did not embellish and she did not soften. The judge's representative, a young lawyer named Pfeiffer, who seemed perpetually on the verge of being overwhelmed by the size of the case he had been handed, told her afterward that her testimony was unusually specific and that the documentary evidence, the notebook, the cross-reference county records, the letter Voss had been carrying, constituted a stronger case than most juries saw in a decade of frontier court proceedings. She said, "Will it be enough?" He said, "For the murder charge, yes. For the conspiracy, yes, I believe so, though it will take time to follow all the threads." She said, "There are other people in the network, men I couldn't identify from initials." He said, "We'll identify them. That's what investigations are for." He paused. "Miss Mercer, what you've done here, bringing this forward the way you did, under the circumstances you did it, I want you to understand that it matters beyond your father's case. The connections we're pulling on are going to reach things that have needed reaching for years." She said, "I know." She paused. "That doesn't make it feel like less." He said, "No, it wouldn't." He said it without condescension, which she appreciated. She walked back to Garfield Street through the October afternoon with the wind off the mountains in her face, and she thought about what it felt like to have done something that mattered beyond yourself. She had not done it for that reason. She had done it to survive, and then to stop her father, and then because the truth was already out and stopping partway made no sense. She had not been thinking about reach and consequence. She had been thinking about staying alive and staying free and making sure the things she had witnessed did not simply disappear into the managed silence that had surrounded her whole life. But Pfeiffer was right that it reached further. And she found, walking in the October wind, that she was glad of that. Quietly, tiredly, without drama, she was glad. Wyatt had taken a room at a hotel 2 streets from the boarding house while the cattle sale settled and the outfit rested. He came to Garfield Street most evenings, which Margaret observed without comment, though Evelyn noticed that there was always extra food at the table on those evenings, which was Margaret's version of approval. One evening, about a week and a half into their time in Cheyenne, they sat on the porch after supper in the cold because neither of them wanted to go inside yet. And Wyatt had his coffee and she had hers, and the street was quiet the way streets in cold weather are quiet, everyone drawn in by the temperature and the dark. He said, "Cattle sold well." She said, "Good." He said, "Clement Briggs got a letter from Aldridge about the case, about what you provided." She looked at him. He said, "He wants to know if there's anything he can do for you. In his words, anything at all." She said, "He doesn't owe me anything." He said, "He disagrees." Strongly, apparently. She thought about Clement Briggs and 200 head and $312 in a ledger under no name, and the rancher who had lost something and never gotten an answer. She said, "Tell him I'm glad he got one." Wyatt said, "I'll tell him." A pause. The cold settled around them. She said, "I've been thinking about what to do. Here, what I said to Decker about wanting something mine." He said, "And?" She said, "There's a merchant on the main street. Supplies for ranchers, tools, dry goods, some tack. The owner is trying to sell because he's going back east," he said, "to be near his daughter. The price he's asking is more than I have, considerably more." Wyatt said, "How considerably?" She said, $420, with the stock included. She paused. "I have 42. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "What would you do with it?" She said, "Expand the account side. Right now he does everything by memory, which is why the business is smaller than it should be. Ranchers won't buy on credit from someone who doesn't have proper books. But if the books were right and the relationships were right, you could build a credit arrangement with ranchers across the territory, and they would come to you instead of riding to the next town." She had been thinking about this for several days, and it came out in the clear, organized way that her thinking about numbers always came out, the architecture of it already built in her head. "And I'd add to the inventory. Things ranchers actually need that he doesn't currently stock because he doesn't know what they need, because he's not a rancher." Wyatt said, "But you are." She said, "I grew up on one. It's close enough." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking, which was a particular quality about him she had noticed. His thinking was not invisible. It had a texture, a kind of deliberate weight that you could almost sense the movement of if you were paying attention. He said, "I have money from the drive and from prior drives." She said, "Wyatt." He said, "I'm not offering you charity. I'm saying I have capital, and you have a plan that makes sense, and that's usually how business arrangements start." She looked at him. She said, "A business arrangement." He said, "Or whatever you want to call it." He met her eyes. "I'm not going anywhere. The next drive doesn't leave until spring, and I've been thinking that there are things worth staying in one place for." She held his gaze. She said, "You've thought about this a lot." He said, "Since before Ridgecross." She said, "Since before Ridgecross, while we were still running cattle in a sleet storm with my father somewhere behind us." He said, "I'm practical." She said, "You're something." He almost smiled. She waited. And then, for the first time since she had met him, the almost smile went all the way. Not a big thing, not theatrical, just a real and complete smile from a man who did not distribute them carelessly, which meant this one was worth something. She felt it somewhere that she was not prepared to name yet. She said, 50-50, if we do this. Equal partnership, equal say. He said, "Yes." She said, "I keep the books." He said, "Obviously." She said, "And I make the decisions about what we stock and what we don't." He said, "You know the rancher side better than I do. That makes sense." She said, "We might argue about things." He said, "Probably." She said, "I'm not going to manage my way around disagreements. If I think you're wrong, I'll say so." He said, "I'd be disappointed if you didn't." She looked out at the quiet street. She thought about the room on the second floor with the east-facing window and the good morning light, and about the merchant on the main street with his disorganized books and his departure date, and about ranchers across the territory who needed a supplier they could trust. She thought about her mother standing at the kitchen window with the morning light coming through it, turning to look at Evelyn with the expression Evelyn had finally gotten right in the dream. Not sadness, not pride. The belief that her daughter would be all right. She said, "All right, talk to the merchant." He said, "In the morning." She said, "In the morning?" They sat in the cold a little longer, not saying much, which was its own kind of conversation. The merchant's name was Hafner, and he was in fact eager to go. The negotiation took 2 days, during which Evelyn went through his books with the thoroughness of someone who had spent years finding discrepancies in documents designed to hide them, and found that the inventory was in better shape than the ledgers suggested, and the ledgers were in worse shape than Hafner believed. She told him this plainly. He seemed relieved rather than offended, which she took as confirmation that he was genuinely done with it. She and Wyatt paid $410. Hafner threw in the sign. The sign said Hafner's Supply. She took it down the first week and replaced it with one that said Mercer and Boone, General Supply and Ranch Goods, which she painted herself over 2 evenings on the porch, Margaret watching from the window with an expression that Evelyn chose to interpret as supportive. Cole looked at the sign when he came to help move the initial inventory and said, "Mercer and Boone." "Boone." Wyatt said, "Yes." Cole looked at both of them. He said, "Hmm." Wyatt said, "What?" Cole said, "Nothing," in the voice of a man who meant several things. The first month was hard in the specific way that new businesses are hard, which is to say that the gap between the plan and the reality was occupied by a large number of things nobody had anticipated. The credit arrangement she had envisioned required relationships she didn't yet have, and building them took time and personal calls, and the willingness to ride out to ranches and sit across from men who were skeptical of a young woman in a business context and demonstrate patiently and repeatedly that she knew what she was talking about. Some of them came around in one visit, some took 3. 2 never came around at all, and she stopped spending time on them and spent it on the others instead. She was not always patient. There was a rancher named Dodd, who spoke to her as though she might be confused about where she was, and she looked at him across his own kitchen table and said, "I've kept ranch accounts since I was 14 years old. I can read your operation from the state of your tack room and the age of your fence line and the condition of your working dogs. You need 3 things before spring, and you don't yet know what one of them is. Do you want me to tell you, or would you prefer to keep explaining to me how business works?" Dodd stared at her. Then he laughed, a genuine surprise laugh, the laugh of a man who hadn't expected to be caught out and found it funny rather than threatening. He said, "What's the 3rd thing?" She told him. He ordered it that week. Wyatt heard the story from her that evening and sat with it for a moment and then said, "How do you know what a man needs from his tack room and fence line?" She said, "I grew up on a working ranch for 18 years. He said, "Right." She said, "You thought being locked in a bedroom canceled that out?" He said, "No, sometimes it's striking." She said, "What is?" He said, "How much of you there is." She looked at him across the store counter where they were doing the evening inventory, and she did not know exactly what to do with that sentence, so she filed it in the place where she kept everything she was not done thinking about, and went back to the inventory count, and the store settled around them in the particular quiet of a place that was doing what it was supposed to do. The trial of Caleb Mercer was held in January, in Laramie County, before the circuit judge. Evelyn went. She had considered not going, had weighed it for a week, going back and forth on whether her presence was necessary or whether it was just punishment she was inflicting on herself for reasons she couldn't entirely justify. And then she had decided to go because not going felt like the old habit of making herself small to avoid the weight of things. She sat in the courtroom and she listened to her own testimony read into the record by Pfeiffer, and she listened to the testimony of the 2 men from the camp who had made their decisions about cooperation, and she listened to 3 other witnesses she had not known existed, ranchers and a former associate of Pruitt's who had been sitting on information for years and had finally decided, now that the structure was coming apart, that they would rather be on the right side of it. Her father sat at the defendant's table with his lawyer and his managed expression, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and it was the last time, she thought. The last time they would look at each other across a room as the only 2 people who fully understood what the other one was. He was convicted on the murder charge and 2 counts of criminal conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in territorial prison. It was not the maximum. She had not hoped for the maximum. She had hoped for the truth to be heard in a room where it mattered, and it had been. Outside the courthouse, in the January cold, Wyatt stood beside her and said nothing. She stood with the cold on her face and thought about 15 years and what her father would be at the end of it. 70-some, if he lived that long, and he probably would because men like Caleb Mercer had a way of surviving things by sheer force of management, and she thought about who she would be at the end of it. She thought she would be someone her mother would have recognized. She said, "All right." Wyatt said, "All right?" She said, "I'm ready to go home." He looked at her. She realized what she had. She said, "To Cheyenne, to the store." He said, "I know what you meant." She said, "Do you?" He said, "You called it home." She had. She stood with that for a moment, the strange rightness of it, the fact that a room above a boarding house on Garfield Street and a store with a painted sign and a set of accounts she was building from scratch had become, in 4 months, a thing she could call home without it feeling like an approximation. She said, "I suppose I did." They rode back to Cheyenne together, which took 2 days, and arrived in the evening to find Margaret had left a lamp on in the boarding house window, and the store was locked and quiet on the dark street, the sign she had painted visible in the lamplight from across the road. Mercer and Boone. She stood and looked at it for a moment. Then she went inside. Spring came and Wyatt's next drive was scheduled, and then 2 weeks before it was set to leave, he came to the store in the morning and stood in the doorway and said, "I need to talk to you about something." She was doing the accounts. She looked up. He said, "I've been thinking about the drive." She said, "And?" He said, "Cole can lead it. He's led sections of it before. He knows the route and he knows the men." He paused. "I've been thinking that there are things in Cheyenne worth staying for." She put down the pencil. She looked at him properly. She said, "You love that drive." He said, "I do." She said, "Then go." He said, "Evelyn." She said, "Go this time. Lead your drive. Come back in the fall." She held his gaze. "I'll be here. The store will be here. And when you come back, we'll figure out what staying looks like, what it means for both of us, not just what it costs you." He stood in the doorway for a moment. He said, "You're sure?" She said, "I've been running this store for 4 months. I think I can manage another 5. He said, "That's not what I'm asking." She said, "I know, and yes, I'm sure." She paused. "You don't have to stop being who you are for me to be who I am. That's not how I want this to work." He looked at her for a long time. He said, "Where did you come from?" She said, a locked room in Wyoming." A pause. "Among other places." He left in April with his outfit, Cole riding beside him, and she stood at the edge of the street and watched them go with the particular feeling of someone who is not afraid of an absence because they understand that absence is not the same as loss. She went back inside and opened the accounts book and started the morning's work. The store grew through that spring and summer in ways she had planned for and ways she hadn't. A rancher's wife named Clara started coming in weekly, initially for supplies and then for conversation, and then Clara brought her sister and her sister's neighbor. And somehow by midsummer, Evelyn had a circle of women who understood the practical realities of frontier life and appreciated talking to someone who spoke that language without condescension. She had not planned for that. She found she was glad of it. She hired a boy named Tobias to help with the heavy stock in July, and she paid him fairly and taught him the basic principles of inventory management, and he turned out to have a good memory and a genuine interest in the work, which meant she could take on larger orders without everything falling apart if she was occupied elsewhere. She wrote to Aldridge occasionally. He wrote back. The threads of the network her father had been part of were still being followed, slowly, through the machinery of territorial law, and names were emerging that she had seen only as initials, and those names were having their own days in their own courtrooms. And the whole structure was coming apart piece by piece, the way large structures do when the central logic holding them together is gone. Wyatt came back in September. He came into the store on a Tuesday morning, trail dusty and lean from months on the trail, and she was behind the counter writing an order for a rancher in the next valley, and she looked up, and there he was. She said, "How was the drive?" He said, "Good. Cattle were good. Weather held until Nebraska." She said, "Cole managed well?" He said, "Better than I expected, and I expected a lot." He set his hat on the counter. He looked around the store, at the shelves she had reorganized and expanded, at the new section of tack equipment, at the handwritten list of credit accounts posted on the wall behind her. "You've been busy." She said, "There's a lot to do." He said, "Yes." He looked at her much. "How are you?" She said, "I'm well, genuinely well. Things are complicated and the legal proceedings are still ongoing and I don't sleep perfectly every night, but..." She stopped, started again. "I'm actually well." He said, "Yeah, I can see that." She said, "Is that surprising?" He said, "No, but it's good to see with my own eyes." She looked at him. She had thought about this moment on various evenings over the summer. His return, what it would feel like, what needed to be said or not said. And she had expected to feel a kind of rushing relief, the completion of a waiting. What she actually felt was simpler and more solid than that, not relief, just right. The particular rightness of something in its correct position. She said, "I want to show you something." She took him around the counter and through the back of the store to the small room she had made into an office, a proper office, with a proper desk and shelves, and the accounts ledgers lined up with the particular precision of a person who understood what good books meant and what they could prevent. She said, "This is what we have." She opened the primary ledger and laid it on the desk. Revenue this summer was 40% above what Hafner's last year looked like, which I know from his old records. Credit accounts in good standing, 14 ranching operations in 4 counties. Inventory turnover is up because I restocked based on what actually sold rather than what Hafner thought should sell. She walked him through it, all of it, the numbers and the patterns, and the things that were working and the things that were still problems, and the plan she had for the problems. He listened without interrupting. This was one of the things about him she had cataloged over the months. He was a genuine listener, the kind that made you feel that what you were saying was actually landing somewhere rather than just being politely received. When she finished, he said, "What do you need from me?" She said, "I need you to tell me what ranchers on the drive routes need that they can't easily get, what they're going through Cheyenne for that they wish someone in the smaller stops would carry." He thought about it. He said, "Specific grades of rope, good quality tack repair leather, not the cheap stuff. Reliable lamp oil in volume." She wrote it down. He said, "And I need to tell you something." She looked up. He said, "When I was on the drive this summer, there were days when I thought about coming back differently than I ever thought about coming back before. Not just finishing the work and returning to the next thing, but actually coming back to a specific place, to a specific person." She said, "Wyatt." He said, "I'm not good at this kind of conversation." She said, "You're doing fine." He said, "I want to—" He stopped, looked at the ledger and then at her. "I want to be here. Not instead of the work. I don't think that's the right trade and I don't think you'd want it, but I want this to be the place I'm coming back to." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a man who had broken down a door for a woman he didn't know, not out of heroism, but out of the simple refusal to ride past something he could do something about. She thought about firelight and coffee and a revolver handed to her without ceremony, and her name on a page that changed things. She said, "Then stay." He said, "Just like that." She said, "We'll work out the details. We're good at that." She paused. "But yes, stay." He nodded. The real smile, the full one, the one he distributed like something rare. She held it in the way you hold things that matter. Not too tight, not too loose. Just present with the weight of it. They were married the following spring in a small proceeding at the Laramie County Courthouse, witnessed by Margaret and Cole and Tobias and a rancher named Dodd who had driven 4 hours to be there and didn't explain why and didn't need to. They did not move. The store was on Garfield Street and the boarding house was 2 blocks away, and Cheyenne was where the work was, and so Cheyenne was where they stayed. They bought a small house the year after. Nothing grand. A wood-framed place with a porch and a yard big enough for a kitchen garden that Evelyn maintained with the same methodical attention she maintained everything. And they lived in it the way working people live in houses, which is to say, imperfectly and with varying degrees of chaos and with the accumulated evidence of 2 people's lives slowly filling the available space. They argued sometimes. About the store, about money, about decisions that affected both of them. The arguments were real arguments, not managed silences or controlled retreats. She said what she thought, and he said what he thought, and sometimes they were both wrong, and sometimes one of them was right, and occasionally they arrived at a third thing that neither of them had thought of before the argument started. She appreciated the arguments. They were the evidence that neither of them was making themselves small to keep the peace. She thought about that sometimes. About her mother. About what it had cost Rose Mercer to choose smaller versions of herself, and what it had produced in the daughter watching from the other room. Not peace, not safety, just the illusion of both for as long as the illusion could be maintained. She did not make herself small. She was not always right. She was not always easy to be around. She was, she thought, exactly the size she was supposed to be, no more and no less. And the imperfect life she was building inside that size was hers in a way that nothing in her first 18 years had been. Her father served his sentence. She did not visit him. She received word through Pfeiffer when he was released, older, apparently slower, the ranch long since sold to satisfy the legal judgments against it. She was told he had gone somewhere south. She did not know exactly where, and she did not ask. He was not a chapter that needed a different ending. It had ended. The store became, in time, something she had not entirely planned for when she painted the sign. Not just a supply merchant, but a place where people came to solve problems and find information, and occasionally just to talk to someone who understood their situation, because Evelyn Mercer Boone had made it her business to understand situations, to read them the way she had learned to read cattle and weather and ledgers and men, with attention and without illusion. On an October morning, 5 years after she had walked out of a locked room with smoke in her hair and $42 in a tin box, she stood behind the counter of Mercer and Boone, General Supply and Ranch Goods, and watched the morning light come through the east window, not the boarding house window, the store window, her window, and thought about the particular shape of the life she had arrived at. It was not the life anyone had planned for her. It was not smooth or idealized or finished. The account sometimes didn't balance on the first try. The roof needed work every spring. There were ranchers who still underestimated her until they learned better, and a few who never learned at all. The legal threads from her father's network were still occasionally surfacing in courtrooms around the territory, and sometimes she was called to verify something or confirm a detail, and each time she went and said what was true and came home afterward to the imperfect house and the real work. Wyatt came back from a short drive in the evenings and talked about cattle, and she talked about the store, and they ate supper and argued about something and laughed about something else and went to bed in a house that was theirs. She ran her hand over the cover of the morning's ledger. She thought about a room with boards across the window and a door that locked from outside, and she thought about what that room had been. Not just a punishment, but the final and most honest expression of a life built around control, around the idea that people could be managed like numbers in a column, moved to where they were useful and contained where they were inconvenient. She had lit a fire in that room. She had made smoke and noise and an undeniable situation, and a door had come down, and she had walked out. Everything after that had been her own. She opened the ledger to the morning's page. She picked